right. Good morning, afternoon, evening, students, whenever you're watching this. This is my Super Saturday video for 2021. This is back to normal AP exams somewhat for my students. My kids are all taking it in person, so I'll be treating this review as a review for the in-person exams. I'll make some mention to differences between the in-person and remote exams for any of you that are taking it remotely. But for all of my students who are taking it in person, this is mostly geared around them. So in this video, I'm going to be reviewing every major FRQ topic in AP Macro. And in doing so, we'll also end up preparing you a lot for multiple choice questions. I'm going to be going through every graph of the course in kind of chronological order of when you probably should have learned it, with one exception that I bumped the Phillips curve up a little bit earlier into the video. I then go through the other major FRQ topics like absolute comparative advantage in terms of trade, and I'm also going to be hitting Unit 2's math a little bit and bank balance sheets a little bit. So I'm going to be going through basically every FRQ topic you can see on the AP Macro exam, and in doing so should also help cover you for any kind of problems you might have on those questions or the multiple choice questions. So get started here in a second. To anybody who's watching this video, I will later on, once the video posts and gets uploaded and sort of saves onto YouTube, I will in the description of the video link the PowerPoint that I have made here. And for my students in my class, this PowerPoint can be found under my AP exam review folder on Moodle, where it is listed as the AP Macro exam review, or AP Macro graph review is what it's listed under. Yeah, it's under AP Macro Super Saturday on AP exam review on my Moodle. So I'll be going through that PowerPoint. It looks like it's long. It's because I'm going over it for the next 4 hours. Because I hate having a weekend, and I really, really desperately want you guys to pass the AP Econ exam, so I'm sacrificing free time. So I'll be going through every graph here in about a second. To all of you guys who are watching live, thank you very much. If you're watching this after the fact and you have a question, I will be checking this channel and this video pretty much non-stop up until the AP exam. So if you are watching it at 11 o'clock on Monday while I'm live streaming another video, I will be trying to also check back on this as comments, and anything that you post I will try to respond to best I can. I had some comments yesterday on some of my videos that I was able to get to this morning, so thank you to all of you guys that have been posting those questions. Greatly appreciate it. I do need to clarify things all of the time. I talk very quickly. Cool. Oh, in terms of fund sponsorship, there isn't a sponsor for this video, but econinc.com makes great stickers. Like in the long run, we're all dead, which is actually an econ one, and this one. Cool. Feel free to buy their stuff. It's cool. All right. So let's get started. Pull up the PowerPoint, and here we go. Okay, the graphocalypse. So this is going through every graph of the entire AP Econ exam. I'm going to explain them all in detail, and then I have an FRQ for each of them that I'm going to explain to sort of show you how the AP exam will ask about this one, what kind of things they'll make you say, and how you need to interpret it, and help point out some classic like trick question things that the AP Macro exam has. If you have any questions while I'm going through this stuff, post them in the chat. I will get to them as soon as I can. But before we get started, let's get Archer on cam for a second. Archer, hello. Say hello to the camera. You don't speak ever. Okay. He'll be in the background. You might be able to see him in his little bed that's in the back there. I'll try to position myself so that you can see him if he ever sleeps in that. He doesn't do that very often. Okay. He, for some reason, likes sleeping on the floor a bunch. All right. Okay. So first things first, easiest graphs in the course. Here's our full list of graphs. We've got the production possibilities curve. Mentally draw that in your head. Check. The regular supply and demand graph. The short run and long run aggregate supply and demand graphs. The short run and long run Phillips curve graphs. The money market. The global funds market. The foreign exchange market for some reason is cut off on here, which it shouldn't be. And the business cycle. Those are the list of graphs. The business cycle is, out of all of these, the only one that you don't really ever have to draw, but it is a graph that you should know and be familiar with. It's the wavelength looking one for any of my students who are like, what graph is he talking about? It's the wavelength looking thing. All right, so we start from the top. Let's hit the first one, the easiest one, right at the jump. The production possibilities curve. Logically, one of the dumbest graphs in that it is an incredible oversimplification of how an economy works, but it basically just tells us if this economy is nailing it, if they're crushing it, what is the max level of stuff they can produce when you plot their two most productive goods. So for this, and what is very common to see on the AP Macro exam, because they're trying to be macro about it, is that they would pick capital and consumer goods, which are some Unit 1 vocab things. Consumer goods are just goods that are immediately used up, food, water, paper, things like that. Capital goods are goods that help you produce more things. So we see that this economy can produce max 450 capital, max 10 consumer goods, probably tons, who cares, doesn't really matter. The curve itself, the line, which is the graph basically, represents full employment. So like being here on the curve, being here on the curve, being here on the curve, being there or there, it is all full employment. It is all good, basically. The only differences between those points is basically what proportion of capital and consumer goods are you trying to hit? Are you trying to get like a good mix of both? Are you trying to prioritize capital goods, which would help you with long-term growth? Are you trying to produce more consumer goods, which will help you with short-term issues like hunger and stuff like that? Any point inside the curve would be inefficient. So like if they made 6 and 100, that'd be bad. That'd be much less than they theoretically should be able to produce. They're underperforming. There is some type of unemployment. That could be physical unemployment of workers. That could be not using all of your resources appropriately, etc. Could be anything like that. Could be a recession, which has a period of time of high unemployment. You would show that. Oops, sorry. Let me change my mouse setting. Could be a recession because that's a period of time of high unemployment as well. The curve can move out to the right when there are more or better resources. That's fairly simple. If I got better tech, tools, machinery, I should be able to produce more stuff. So I would shift the curve out. An important thing to know later on in the course, like way after we learn about production possibilities curve, is that moving the PPC outward is a means of showing economic growth. That if I move that curve out to the right, I would be showing economic growth. If I had fewer resources as a whole, if my maximum level of production was getting decreased from something, like a massive natural disaster that wipes out a bunch of usable land and stuff, then my curve would shift in. You can also show trade-offs and opportunity costs through changes by moving from one point to another on this curve. So like going from here, a point where I'm at 0 consumer and 450 capital goods, to a point, say, like here, where I have 9 consumer goods and 200 capital goods, the opportunity cost of going from that spot to that spot would be the 250 capital goods that I've given up. Now, the only types of things that really throw students off here are, one, you don't always draw the PPC as a bowed out curve like this. It's the most common way to see it. It is not a guaranteed way to see it. If you're seeing a PPC drawn like this, it's a PPC with increasing opportunity costs. Because like from here to here, I'm giving up barely any capital goods. But from here to here and down on the line, the slope is getting steeper progressively, that I'm giving up a significantly larger amount of capital goods per consumer good as I move down the line. So my opportunity cost is increasing. It's getting steeper. The other way you'd see this is a constant opportunity cost, which would be a straight line linear production possibilities curve. And the reason why you would see that is either a question tells you that it's got constant opportunity cost, or if the two goods you are being provided here have very similar resources. The example I use in class is pizza and calzones. Like those are two goods that are pretty much the exact same. So going from making one of one to two of the other, I don't know why that would ever change reasonably. But for something like capital and consumer goods, these are goods that have wildly different resources, so moving from one to the other isn't always going to be a smooth transition, is a way to think about it. Now, last thing here that I mentioned is that the PPC and the long-run aggregate supply are representative of the same idea. They both are showing you kind of the same thing, which is what is the amount of things I can produce if I'm at full employment. LRAS, that's the level of GDP I'd be at if I was at full employment. For this, it's showing me any combination of goods I can produce at full employment, but it's the same concept, where it's like this is our maximum level of production if we're doing really well. So if I'm not on the line, then something's going on in my economy. If I'm below the line, with like a dot below the line, there'd be like a recession going on. If I'm at a dot above the line, I'm overdoing it. I'm producing too much. I am probably in an inflationary gap of some kind. So there's your nice and brief overview of the production possibilities curve. So here is the like sort of, I would say, classic production possibilities curve question from an AP exam. I use it in class all the time. It hits a bunch of different things in the course, but its focus is on the production possibilities curve. So if you want to take a look at it really quickly, some of you guys in my class have seen this before. If you're watching this later on, feel free to pause the video at various points before I start solving questions and attempt to solve them yourself. If you're watching live, you can also pause it, but whenever you hit play, it's going to catch you up to where I am right now. So be aware of that. Okay. So consumer and capital goods, no numbers are given here. The graph shows PPC for Fisherland, the production of which of the following exhibits increasing opportunity cost. So it's telling you it's got increasing opportunity cost. Good, it does. But is it the production of consumer goods, capital goods, both, or neither? This is a sort of classic AP exam trick thing where they're trying to throw you off by like, they know you know it's increasing opportunity costs, but of which? And you're like, what? But we never, it's just both. Don't freak yourself out. The slope is getting steeper going from this direction to this direction, yes, but if you sort of flip it, like if I'm imagining this graph like it's currently X and Y just like this, if I rotated the graph like that and was finding the opportunity costs going this way, it's also getting steeper that way. So it's both. It'd be weird if it was one and not the other in terms of it's getting more costly to make consumer goods for capital goods. It would also be getting more costly to make capital goods instead of consumer goods. Because it's not like I'm more, how do I phrase this? It's not like it's a smoother transition going from one to the other than going from the other back to the one, if that makes any sense. Okay, but it's a curve both ways is basically what I'm telling you. Like it's the same shape both ways, so why wouldn't it be both? Okay, redraw the graph given above. I redrew it. Show a point that represents full employment and efficiently used resources on the graph and label it A. Great. Literally anywhere on the curve would do it. Gotta love that question. That question's worth a point. We'll take those every time. Assume there is a recession in Fisherland. On your graph in part C, label as C a point representing the recession. So, and we'll see this a bunch today because I'm going through a bunch of FRQs. The AP exam drops lots of hints in the questions, so read them very carefully for the FRQs. The most common mistake that happens for C is that students tend to do this with recessions a lot of the time on a production possibilities curve. They draw a new curve inward to show that like we can't produce as much, which they're not terribly wrong, but a recession is shown by a point inside the curve. Now, here's the nice thing. It told you that. It says label as C a point representing the recession. It didn't say a line, it said a point. That's saving you a bunch of mental energy if you're like, wait, do I draw a line or do I draw a point? I'll read the question. It says a point. Okay, makes it a lot easier. Now, why it's a point and not a line is that when I'm in a recession, my maximum level of production hasn't changed. Like, my peak is the same if I'm in a recession. The problem with the recession is that I'm producing less than what I am supposed to be producing. A is what I'm supposed to be producing. C is where I'm at right now. If I decrease the production possibilities curve, what you are telling me is our maximum level of production has gone down. And that's not true. In a recession, your max hasn't dropped. It wouldn't be as bad, I guess, if your max had dropped. Because the reason why recession is bad is because you should be able to produce a lot more than you're currently producing. This point C tells me that. It's like, oh, this is bad because I should be here, but I'm here. Whoops. That's not what I want. Okay, D and E are both things that we'll be tying more into the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves in the short and the long run and the fiscal policy stuff, but let's hit them because this is a review, so we might as well answer everything. Identify a fiscal policy action that the Fisherland government can take to address the recession. Oh, Mona asks good questions. Do we have to draw an arrow from point A to point C? On this question, probably not. Because it doesn't ask you that it's a shift. It just sort of tells you that it was there and is now there. So you probably wouldn't have to have drawn that, especially since they tell you to label them clearly. I would still do that. but I'm a person who just always draws arrows as a force of habit. So they wouldn't have probably taken off points for you not drawing an arrow on this because it's clearly telling you to label them, so there's no like discrepancy, no possible issue there. Good question. So a fiscal policy action. Now, when you see something like this, the only thing that I see kids mess up quite a bit is that they will tell me the type, but not the action itself. A lot of my students would say they should do an expansionary policy, which is great. But that is not the answer, because it's asking me for an actual policy. Like, it's cool that you said expansionary. You're right to think expansionary. That is the correct thing. But the answer is an example of it. It's asking for an action themselves. Not the type, but the actual action. Oops, sorry, I just kicked my desk. Okay. Which would be one of two things, fairly simple ones here. If you increased government spending, that would work. Or if you decreased taxes. Please understand that while I'm writing stuff onto this screen here, I am writing it with like a weird pen software and my mouse. So I'm not going to write full sentences for this. You should still be writing full sentences. Don't abbreviate everything that I'm abbreviating on my answers here. Like I would say, the government should increase government spending or decrease taxes. Doesn't say to explain it, which is nice, but I would still say the full thing. And then E, assume that no discretionary policy actions are taken, meaning the government isn't choosing to do anything. Will SRAS increase, decrease, or remain the same in the long run? We're going to get to this later, but let's show it now to prepare you for what is usually one of the hardest things for kids to just deal with in the class because it is inherently pretty complicated and isn't as pure logic as the rest of the class tends to be. And that is the long-run self-adjustment. So they're telling me basically C or D didn't happen. You are in a recession, things are going poorly, but your government isn't doing anything. What will happen to SRAS? So basically this is what my graph looks like right now. On my aggregate supply graph, I am in a recession. This question doesn't ask me to draw the aggregate demand supply graph, but if it's asking me about this, I should be visualizing it. You don't need to draw it, but this is what popped up into my head. So I'm in a recessionary gap. If there is no government policy action, if the government doesn't do anything, what always, I'm yelling into the microphone at this point, always happens, is if the government's not doing anything, SRAS moves to get back to full employment. So in this case, since we're in a recession, I would need my short-run aggregate supply curve to increase. This is called the long-run self-adjustment. So for the full logic of it, which I'll explain here in a second, what we're thinking is they are in a recession. That means a bunch of stuff's probably happened. Unemployment's really high. Inflation's probably dipped down. That is typical, not guaranteed, but typical during recessions to have less inflation. And our economy is doing generally worse. So if the government's not doing anything, what the long-run self-adjustment is about is that eventually the economy will fix itself. And if the government's not going to do it, it kind of has to be businesses. It's not really capable that consumers can act in such a way to sort of fix the economy on our own. Because I can't just like magically spend more or just magically spend less. I kind of have to buy things to live. So like I can't just randomly change my behavior like that. Businesses do have a variable that they control that does allow them to change their ability to produce things though. And that's wages. Because in the long run, wages can change. Wages become flexible in the long run. They can go up and down. Well, if I'm in a recession as a business, I'm probably, and I can reasonably say, I could lower the wages of my workers because things are going fairly poorly for kind of everybody here. I can't really afford to pay them as much. But if I do that, if I pay my workers less, then as a business, I would have more money to spend on things like capital if I wanted to buy capital, or just hiring more workers, and I would get back to full employment. So for this answer, for the explanation here, which this is where it gets kind of annoying because you do have to explain a decent amount in this, you would say SRAS will increase, which to be clear, this part E is worth 2 points, one for saying what happens to SRAS, the second point for explaining it. So if you felt super confident about A through D, and you're like, man, I'm probably going to not do a good job on my explanation point here, You got more than 80% of the points in this question. If you got A through D in the first part of E, you're doing great. Don't stress yourself out. But the explanation that I would write here is, in the long run, SRAS will increase because as the recession occurs, businesses can lower wages, which will allow them to hire more workers and ramp up their productivity. You could also say that as the recession occurs, resources probably become more affordable due to a decrease in price level. This is not a guarantee thing that happens every time there's a recession, but it's a normal thing to happen. And that as those resources become less expensive, you can then buy more resources and ramp up production. So whatever you're doing here, you have to make it make sense that SRAS is increasing. Whether that be that businesses are lowering wages and hiring more workers, which is a thing they can kind of do whenever, or that if we're in a recession, there's a decent enough chance that resources have gotten cheaper, which would mean that you can afford to acquire more of them and produce more. The long-run self-adjustment always feels kind of weird to explain them because you're just sort of predicting and hoping that it works, but it's a bit tricky. Okay. So that's kind of it for the production possibilities curve in terms of a topic. I haven't hit 1,000 out of 1,000 things that I can hit here. The only other thing I would probably mention is that moving from like this point to this point is one, still efficient, and two, could be caused by the following, and this is a thing students don't always realize, which is like, say we start using the resources we were using for consumer goods on capital goods instead. Say we sort of pivot from making a bunch of consumer goods to a bunch of capital goods. That would do this. Because if I was using those resources on consumer goods, I could still make that amount. But I'm choosing to use them on capital goods instead. I don't really have more resources, I'm just allocating them differently. So like different points along the curve are different allocations of my resources, different proportions that I'm skewing towards one good or the other. And also you can move from one point or another along the curve by a change in demand. Say people in this economy really want a bunch more capital goods. Okay, well then I would do this. I would pivot away from consumer goods and more towards capital goods. Remember, the line is the maximum ability to produce these goods. If I'm not changing the max ability, I'm not changing the line itself. Okay, PPC, and I did hit the long-run self-adjustment here, so I won't have to explain that as hard or later in the video. What does discretionary policy mean again? A discretionary policy, good question, is a policy action that the government actually has to choose to enact. It's one that like Congress will actually have to pass a bill to do this. So that would be like changing government spending or changing taxes, because both of those require legislation. Most of your fiscal policies that you guys will deal with are discretionary. The non-discretionary ones are what are referred to as the automatic stabilizers. Those are things like when you go into a recession, tax revenue tends to drop. It's not because they changed taxes, it's because when you're in a recession, people are making less money and going unemployed, so they're paying less in taxes. Right? Like, I didn't do anything as a government there to make tax revenue go down, but since there's a recession, tax revenue would drop because people won't be making as much money and therefore can't be taxed as much. So automatic stabilizers, the government doesn't have to do anything, it just sort of is happening. Discretionary policy, which is the actual chose to be one, is a change to government spending or taxes. Most of the time you're doing discretionary policy. On an FRQ, they really don't ever have you do automatic stabilizer stuff. Multiple choice, I might reference it. Okay, supply and demand, basic. The most basic supply and demand graph. This one, I'm going to sort of skim through it a little bit, not because it's not important, but because it is not asked about as much. If you are taking the AP Macro and the AP Micro exam, you'll have to deal with this graph quite a bit. If you're just taking AP Macro, though, this thing just shows up like once or twice maybe. So the big things here is that if you change the price of a good, oops, should I click that? If you change the price of a good, you move along the curve, which I did in my class period yesterday for a lot of my students. They've forgotten about this. That if I like raise the price of the good, I'm just doing this. Which is changing the quantity supplied to this was here, is now here, and the quantity demanded to this was there, not there. Basically, when price goes up for a good, it changes the amount of the good you'd like to buy or the amount of the good the business would like to produce. It doesn't change your desire for the good or the business's desire to produce and sell it. When anything other than the price of the good changes, you will probably have to draw a new curve, meaning you will have to shift the supply or the demand graph. For demand, the shifters, the acronym I use in my class is TRIPE. That's taste and preferences, the price of related goods, income, population, and expectations of future price changes. So, for example, say it's apples and oranges, and the price of apples goes up. The demand for oranges would go up, because if apples are more expensive, I wouldn't be buying them as much, and I would still want my fruit. So I would want more oranges regardless of whatever the price of them were before. Like comparatively, just as a whole, I would be wanting more oranges if the overall price average of apples went up. That'd be a substitute. For supply shifters, the acronym here, I'm going to use the appropriate version of it. I have a dumber version that my students will reference. SEPN, which is competition, expectations of future price changes, profitability of alternatives, and profitability of joint supply, input costs, and natural resources. This is the technical, like, just sort of default list that I find from College Board. I modified it to make it a little more interesting for my students, but profitability is important as well. Basic idea for taxes and subsidies, if you get thrown off by for my students, if you're getting thrown off by that, that's an input cost deal. Input costs is the cost of production. The government can affect that too. If the government is taxing your production more, you can't produce your good as much, so supply would go down. Which, reminder, this is important to mention, a decrease in supply is this. If you're decreasing any line on any graph, you are moving that line to the left. I know that that supply curve is higher vertically. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying that as I decrease it, I've moved it left. Yeah, thanks, Dan. You know. Because at that exact same price as before, this is a terrible dotted line. At like this price, that supply curve to that supply curve, there's a lower quantity on the blue one. So that's a decrease in supply. That's a classic mistake some students who like just space out on graphs will make, is that they'll move supply to the right when they mean decrease, because I moved it down. Left and right, that's all we're thinking here. Increase right, decrease left. Every time, every time, every time, every graph. Okay. So again, this graph is not as heavily emphasized because they don't ask about it as much. Like literally, here is the only FRQ I have literally ever seen on supply and demand in 30 AP exams that I've looked over. Form A and Form B, so that's 2 different AP exams every year. And the I want to say 80 different FRQs they asked last year, because they had a bunch of different versions of it for all the people that were taking it remotely, so they couldn't cheat as easily. And I've seen quite literally just this. It's the only FRQ I've ever seen for supply and demand. I'll run through it real quick, but it's the only one I've ever seen. Now, for my students in class, I do tell them, you guys have terrible luck. Just sort of conceptually, the pandemic is a pretty good example of that. So, don't assume that it's not going to happen. Be prepared for it. But if I'm investing a bunch of time this weekend reviewing things for econ, this is pretty low on the list. So assume that gasoline is sold in a competitive market. Good, you would want that. And the equilibrium price is $50 per barrel. The equilibrium quantity is 1,000 barrels. Okay. Draw a correctly labeled gasoline market, which you're like, what's the gasoline market, Mr. McRitch? We never covered that. It's just a supply and demand graph with the equilibrium price and quantity shown. Now, this is a good thing to mention. They don't do this all the time, and it's a good thing to see on this question. It's useful for all of our graph questions. If they tell me what numbers to put on the graph, I do need to put those numbers on the graph. It tells me the equilibrium quantity is 1,000. It tells me the equilibrium price is 50. So my graph would look like this. I have price and quantity of gas. You could have just written price and quantity. It would have been fine. Supply and demand, I did SG and DG for supply and demand of gas. 50 as my price, 1,000 as my quantity. You don't have to do numbers across the entire X and Y axis. You just have to have the equilibrium labeled there. Okay. B, at a price of $40 per barrel, will there be a surplus or a shortage in the market? Cool. So the equilibrium price is 50. Look at my graph still. Equilibrium price is 50. If the price was 40, that'd be below what it's supposed to be. Would that be a shortage or a surplus? That would be a shortage. If the price is too low, what's going to happen is people are going to frigging love that. If the normal price of a barrel of gasoline is $50 and you're telling me it's 40, that it's 20% off, what am I going to do? I'm going to buy a lot more of it, which is not just me, it's kind of everybody buying a lot more of it, which would mean they're probably going to run out. That's what the shortage is. Visually, an easy way to see this is that if the price is below equilibrium, the price will be shorter than the equilibrium price, like height-wise, which shortage. There you go. You can't say that as your explanation. You can't be like, because it's shorter. It's like, that's not good explanation. It'd be because people will buy more than businesses will want to produce, is the logic. The quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. That price being too low is not super good for the businesses. It's pretty dang good for the consumers. I keep biting my tongue today. That's annoying. Okay. C. Assume new oil wells are discovered on your graph from part A. Show how this change will affect the equilibrium price and quantity in the market for gasoline. So there's a bunch of new oil wells discovered. Supply and demand graph, I've got to think of what that's affecting. Supply or demand. For these, a lot of the time, if you don't want to memorize a list of shifters, you just kind of have to think, who cares about this oil well discovery? This is a significantly more important thing for the producers of oil because they can now acquire more oil than before. So I would say that this allows for the supply of oil to rise. One, there is literally going to be more oil, but also this makes it easier for the businesses to get oil. Like, there's a bunch more of it. So I would say that the supply of oil goes up. As someone who is a consumer, I see this on the news. It doesn't mean that I'm like, oh yeah, let me go get some more oil. Because until they actually harvest the oil wells, it's not like oil's cheaper yet. But once they do start harvesting those oil wells, you should see this increase in supply occur, which will get me, yes, a lower equilibrium price and a higher equilibrium quantity. So where this question says show how it'll affect the quantity and the price, that's where my like dotted lines on my graph are coming in. We're like, hey, look, the price is now lower than 50. The quantity is now higher than 1,000. I don't know what the price and quantity are going to end up at in this situation, so I'm not going to give them a number. I'm going to use just Q1 and P1 for this because I did S1 for my new supply curve. But that's how I'm drawing it for that. On D, assume instead there's an increase in the price of gasoline-operated automobiles. What'll that do to the market? Supply or demand? Well, the companies that make oil aren't the exact same companies that like sell cars. Like Shell doesn't have a car, so this probably isn't affecting the supply. It does affect me as a consumer because I drive a gas-powered car, and I would like to buy a new car in the near future. If gas-powered cars are a bunch more expensive, what might I do? I might buy a not gas-powered car. I might buy a hybrid. I might buy an electric car. Either way, if I buy either of those other cars, I'm not going to need gas as much. So that would be a decrease in demand. I won't want gasoline as much because I won't want the car that requires gasoline as much. Explanation here. It doesn't tell you to draw it here. This is important. Some questions won't ask you to draw. If you draw it, you might be in trouble. Only because if I draw what is a demand decrease on this graph, how will the grader know which of the two lines I did was my answer to C and what was my answer to D? Because D doesn't ask me to draw it. C is the only one here that asks me to draw. So what I would tell you is if you're going to draw it on your graph, you kind of can. Make sure that on your answer document where you write like C, you write like S1. Where it's like, no, the S1 thing is my answer to C. My answer to D is that demand will decrease, and like that's D1 on my graph. And the answer to Y is because consumers will be buying more electric vehicles here and won't want gasoline as much because those gas-powered cars are more expensive. So if they don't tell you to graph it on your graph, be very careful because they won't be looking at your graph for that answer. If you're using it for your answer, great. If you're not, okay, but it's going to get confusing for the grader of what thing on your graph is referencing what part of your answer. I would kind of always do this. Like I wouldn't ever have I wouldn't just start with B on my answer choices. I would do A and I'd say C graph, Like C graph for A. B, I'd write and explain my answer. C, I'd write S1 and then C graph. D, I would write out the full thing. And then E, I would also have to write it out because, again, this is not asking me to graph it. It's just asking if I did both, if I increased supply and if I decreased demand. So I'm going to draw it on my graph so you guys have a visual, but I wouldn't have drawn it on my graph on the test. Where I have the two purple lines where those intersect is my new equilibrium. If I do both, what happens to my price and quantity? I would get a lower price for sure, because like it dropped down even more. But if it gets confusing on the x-axis for you, that's good. It should get confusing on the x-axis for you because it kind of looks like it went back to 1,000 on my graph. If you move both supply and demand, you get an indeterminate variable. My price went down, my quantity is indeterminate. The reason why quantity is indeterminate is if the supply of a good goes up, then the quantity would go up. If the demand for a good goes down, wouldn't there be less of a quantity because people don't want to buy it as much? Right, so there's a higher supply, so higher quantity, lower demand, so lower quantity. Wait, which one is winning? I don't actually know. I don't know if the quantity is going up or down. Right, indeterminate means I don't know. So, or I can't know based off current information is a better way to phrase it. So my quantity is indeterminate. My price is going down because if I decrease the demand for a good, I'd pay less for it, so price would fall. If there's a higher supply of a good, the business would need to lower the price to keep selling it, so price goes down there. Price went down for the higher supply, price went down for the lower demand. Price is going down both ways. I know price is going down. Whenever you're shifting both lines, one of the two variables will be in conflict, which would be, that's the indeterminate one. And that should be basically everything they can ever ask you about the supply and demand graph. Let me turn on the fan, it's getting warm in my apartment now. Don't fall out of the chair, there we go. All right, so that's the Unit 1 stuff. We skip all of Unit 2 because Unit 2 has no graphs. It does have the circular flow model, which I'm going to bring that up at the end. I'm going to bring up the models that aren't things you have to draw, but are things you have to know after I go through all of the graphs, because those are less of a priority. But I'll still go through them in case you've forgotten what the circular flow model is, because you have forgotten what the circular flow model is. Okay, short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand. This is the most important thing in the class. It is, it always has been, it always will be, because this is the graph of our economy. It is telling me what our current GDP should be and what our current price level should be. My short run aggregate supply, the upward sloping one, is based on our current ability to produce things just as a country, like overall. Our aggregate demand curve is based on our current spending ability / spending levels in our economy, because that's how I would track demand for everything, right? Like, how do I check how much people want? Like, as a country, spending? Yeah, it's about right. So, your aggregate demand shifters, 4 things, they are your components of aggregate demand, or your components of GDP. Consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, net exports. Again, investment spending is spending typically by businesses on capital, things that help them produce more long-term. For aggregate supply, and this is your short-run aggregate supply, things that I mentioned in class would be like changes to the cost of labor, changes to the quality of your labor, which those would be like input costs for the cost of labor, productivity for the quality of your labor. The price of natural resources is pretty common, like if gasoline gets really expensive, that hurts your aggregate supply quite a bit. And also changes in some government policies. In my class, this was part of the like input cost umbrella, where it's like, yeah, if the government is taxing businesses more across the board, it's gonna make it kind of harder on them to make stuff. If they're regulating businesses harsher, like making them protect the environment. Hippie garbage. No, it's good to protect the environment. But if they do that, it does make it hard for businesses to produce things because they can't just pollute really easily, which does make their jobs easier. So harsher regulations will decrease your aggregate supply curve. Like, here's a dumb example of like how this is like bad but good. Decreasing aggregate supply is typically bad. Like, you get higher price level, you get lower GDP. If you're in the wrong situation, you could easily cause stagflation. It's all bad. but like child labor laws would decrease aggregate supply. Because like if kids can't work, you have a lot less available labor, so our ability to produce goes down. You should still have child labor laws. It's still probably the right move, because like you shouldn't have like an 8-year-old working in a factory. They could die very easily. They'll die at a younger age. It's bad. It's just bad to do that. So like when we're talking about government regulations and policies, they're like, be aware that even though decreasing aggregate supply is bad, there are situations where you should probably do it. All right, so I'm going to use multiple choice for this because this graph's going to come up a bajillion time in FRQs from here on out. So multiple choice questions are where this gets kind of simple. An increase in energy costs will cause the price level and real GDP to change in which of the following ways. Here's what I'll tell you. On AP exam day, if I'm any of you guys, when the multiple choice question section starts, if I'm allowed scratch paper, which you can always ask for it, I would probably just do a quick sketch of every graph. Have a quick production possibilities curve, don't label the axes. Have a quick aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph. Have a quick Phillips curve, stuff like that. Because I want to have a place to do the visual stuff during the test. I don't want to have to draw an aggregate demand supply curve 55 times. Oh, Krishnov asks a good question. On the exam, when we label our graphs, can we use abbreviations or do we have to spell it out to get to the point? For your equilibriums, you can abbreviate it. For the lines, you can typically abbreviate it. For the axes, a lot of the times you can't. Because like abbreviating for interest rate and inflation rate, you can't just do IR. So there's a good chance you won't know the proper abbreviation for a lot of those axes, so just write it out. Like I always write my axes out unless I'm doing the aggregate demand supply graph, in which case I'll do R GDP instead of real, and on the AP exam, I would write the words price level, but I do PL in this class because I draw this graph about 8 billion times a day. So on your axes, always label your axes fully. On your equilibriums, you can do like YE, PLE. You don't have to write the word equilibrium literally ever. Your X and Y axis, don't write the word supply or demand. S and D is fine. But make sure you do like on the money market graph, S, money, D, money. That's only on the FRQs. On like, you know, just doing it for scratch work, do whatever the hell you want. So for this kind of thing, like, I would do like just this before the exam even starts on like scratch paper or just off to the side on a page. Because on a question like these, I would draw it. Like I'm not gonna mess around. Increase in energy costs, okay. The word cost is a key word. Costs almost always referring to how much it takes for a business to pay for a thing. So this means more of a supply shift than a demand shift because of that. So it's the cost of energy. As a business, that makes it more expensive for me to produce things. I can't produce as much. Aggregate supply decreases, which on my graph gives me a higher price level and a lower real GDP, so B. If they give you these types of columns, like these types of questions, which is a fairly common thing to see, draw a graph. It's almost always a graph problem if they're doing it. It's worth drawing it. It makes your life a lot easier to draw it. Okay, the second one's weird. It's an old question. You can tell because I had to like just print screen it off as opposed to just copy pasting it from AP Classroom. If the economy is operating in the intermediate range of the aggregate supply curve, don't sweat this, but if you take advanced economics classes, you'll find the aggregate supply curve tends to look more like this. It doesn't mean anything here, because the intermediate range would just be the upward sloping part, which is what we deal with. So if we're on our normal aggregate supply and demand curve, if aggregate demand increases, what happens to price level, output, and unemployment rate? Aggregate demand's gone up. I got a higher price level. I got higher output, because GDP is output. And then unemployment rate, you have to know this. This is not told to you anywhere in this. But those two things have an inverse relationship. So increased price level, increased output, lower unemployment rate. Boom. Sequential order matters there. Them going from price level to output to unemployment rate matters. But make sure you're keeping track of it. Be very careful when you're going through it. All that stuff. long run. This is where it gets fun. This is the best part of the class. Everybody loves this part. Okay. All right. So here's the deal with the long run aggregate supply curve. The best way for you to think about it is not to think of it as a separate line, but it's to think about it as a benchmark. That it is where your economy should be is where the vertical line is at. That is the concept of the LRAS. It is in the long run, you should be producing here based on everything you currently have. Based on all the resources you got, based on the labor quality you've got, based on the technology you currently can produce, you should be producing at this amount. So if your graph looks like this, if my SRAS, AD, and LRAS are all in the same spot, what that means logically is that we are at full employment. Our economy is doing very, very well. That's the sort of end game of this whole thing. The things that do change LRAS, which you won't ever really have to draw LRAS moving right or left, but be aware that it can. FRQs might tag that in at the very end of like, hey, what would happen to LRAS here? They do that. We'll see it on some of these questions. Are things like the size of the workforce, because that would change your maximum level of production. Basically, full employment would mean more if you had more workers. Size of capital stock, that's the most obvious one. All the capital you got. Then labor productivity as a whole also. Basically, it has to change your maximum level of production. Now, each of those things would also change SRAS. So if you're like trying to figure out like what's happening on the graph, if I did this, I would be moving LRAS and SRAS to sort of go along with it. Don't worry about having to draw that. If they asked you to draw it, that would be a very new thing. They have never asked you to do that before. I mentioned earlier, a change in the LRS is basically the same as changing your PPC to the right, which you guys have done that quite a bit. Does the scooting concept matter on the test? No, Daniel, not really. That's more of a real world thing. That in the real world, this whole graph is like scooting over to the right. It's because like this stuff is going up all the time, right? Like the size of our workforce is constantly increasing, right? We get more people here every single year. Education should be kind of going up in general over time quite a bit, which it has, even though there's a lot of criticisms of the like public school system. Our overall average education level is better than it was 30 years ago. And we get better tech every year. So like real world, all of this stuff is scooting. You won't ever have to worry about that though, Daniel. Good question. Okay. The long run, if you're wondering, is generally like a year or more, is typically how to think about it. Points below the LRAS to the left indicates that you would not be at full employment. Points to the right would indicate that your economy is in an inflationary gap. So like this is how we see it. That if your economy is like this, you are at A. You are wherever SRAS and AD are. Let's be clear about that. That's where your economy is at. So if that spot is to the right of LRAS, you're in an inflationary gap. The AP exam will possibly / probably, they have been shifting more towards calling this a positive output gap. I'm going to keep calling it inflationary gap because it is pretty good at helping you understand what the issue is here. That if you're past full employment, the problem you're probably going to be dealing with is inflation. Like positive output gap doesn't sound like a bad thing. I don't like that they use that word as much because it isn't great to be past full employment. There is a downside to it. It's a reason why full employment is like the sweet spot. So inflationary gap, aka a positive output gap, easy to remember because your output, GDP, is positive or higher than LRAS. It's easy to figure out. If you don't remember this on Monday, you should be able to figure it out. And in a recessionary gap is where your current equilibrium is behind LRAS. Please understand in these drawings, I am not moving the long run aggregate supply curve. I have moved the other two lines respectively to the left or the right of the graph. Most of the time you will not, again, they haven't ever asked you to draw a shift of the LRAS, only because it makes your graph really cluttered if they do that. They don't even really like you drawing more than one shift on a graph in any question because it gets really cluttered and hard to grade. There's not going to be a question you would draw where you would move LRAS and then not also move SRAS, so that gets really visually confusing for a grader, so they won't ask you to draw that. Okay, I want to mention one more thing with this. In the long run, your economy always wants to be here. This is what our economy sort of gravitates to in the long run. It's why our economy is seen as being, at least to a respect, self-correcting. And it self-corrects to this situation. It wants to be right where it is supposed to be. That if we have all these resources, we should be producing at these amounts. If we're not, it's because something weird is happening. Maybe a global pandemic. That would be a weird thing that is happening that is keeping us from producing our maximum. Or a housing market crash back in 2009. Like something huge will throw this off of its game. Small stuff, you might be a little ahead, a little behind of the line at a given point, but that isn't too big of a deal. Moving really far left or right is when it gets kind of dicey. We are still presently behind this curve when it comes to our production. And the LRAS is also said to be drawn at the natural rate of output. That is just the vocabulary term that dictates this is your level of production at full employment. Like if you're at full employment, your GDP would be this. Additionally, that might also be called potential output or full employment output. It means the same thing. It's like your economy is right where it's supposed to be. Okay, here we go. So assume the economy of Anderson Land is in a long-run equilibrium with full employment. In the short run, nominal wages are fixed. Now, this statement here is important, but it is also kind of a given. I do assume this every time anyway. In the short run, nominal wages are fixed. That just means your paychecks don't really change in the short run. That matters because when price levels going up and down, that'll affect how rich you actually are. So, A, draw a quickly labeled graph of the short run, long run, and aggregate demand. Label everything, basically. Again, a hint has been given to you in this question. Again, a hint has been given to you. So on Krishnov's point, like if this is my FRQ on my AP exam, I am not going to abbreviate the X and the Y axis. Like, in fact, on your FRQ page that you're doing all your FRQs on, your graph should be like a quarter to a third of your page probably. That way you have plenty of room to write like price level and real GDP and equilibrium and all this stuff. Like, that's what my graph would look like on the AP exam day. LRAS, SRAS, AD allowed. Real GDP, I'm not even abbreviating that. Price level, I'm not even abbreviating that. My equilibrium, it's fine. I did capital Y, E, and PLE. I've actually kind of messed up here. They would have probably been fine with me doing this on the AP exam on this one because that's a very normal abbreviation. But it does tell me to label it Y1 and PL1 here. So I should have done that. It's a thing to go back and like double check before you submit of like, oh wait, they asked me to label it like this. But here's the hint. It only tells me to label one output and one price level. If I'm in a recessionary gap or inflationary gap, I actually have like two X values to look at, right? Like I would have, is Y1 here or is Y1 here? Because you could label that like it's here and not there, here, not there. Which one do I label? They'll tell you to label 2 if it's a positive or a negative output gap. They'd be like, label full employment YF and label your current level of output Y1. Like they would tell you 2 things if there's gonna be 2 X values to label. So that's very important to know in the AP exam, that they will drop hints like that. So even if I didn't see long run equilibrium, I can tell because it asked me to draw LRAS and it's only telling me there's one level of output. Boom, it's right there. Okay, assume that there is an increase in exports from Anderson Land. This is Anderson Land. It's saying that they are exporting more. On your graph, show the effect of higher exports on the equilibrium in the short run, labeling the new equilibrium and price level Y2, PL2 respectively. Okay, so I do draw this on this graph. An increase in exports is that there is now more spending on stuff made in Anderson Land. It does not mean the ability to produce things in Anderson Land has gone up. That's important to understand. People might think that exports going up changes aggregate supply. It doesn't. Aggregate supply is not the amount of the thing we're producing. It's our ability to produce things. This doesn't change that. Not in the short run. In the long run, it might. So I should see an increase in aggregate demand because there is now a greater overall demand level for stuff from our economy. Even if it's not our demand, it doesn't matter. It just has to be demand for stuff made here. And by here, I mean Anderson Land. AP exams naming conventions are so stupid. So, We got an increase in aggregate demand. Here's my impact on price level and GDP. I got a higher price level and a higher GDP. Now, the dotted line thing that I do on my graphs, do it. Just do it on your graphs. I know you don't need to, but just do it. Like, it's not like it's hard to draw dotted lines. It doesn't look great. No, who cares? I can tell it. So draw that. All right. So I got a higher equilibrium output, a higher price level. C, this is a good question. Students do mess this up quite a bit. What is the impact of higher exports on real wages in the short run? Ooh. Question mark. Now this is a question that is scary to read. When I ask out loud my students this, they tend to figure it out because the way I phrase it tends to help, which is they're getting paid the same. Their nominal wages are fixed. On this graph, price level went up. Remember that real adjusts for inflation. It takes into account the fact that inflation would be happening. So you're getting paid the same. Everything in the economy is more expensive. So really, you're getting paid less in value. It's because price level went up and your wages stayed the same. You were still getting $10 an hour, but now your Big Mac combo, instead of costing $6, costs $7. Your income stayed the same, but you're functionally poorer now. Real wages is just telling you the actual value of your wages. How far do your wages go? How much can you actually buy based on current prices? Like making the average income in the 80s was like $26,000 a year. The average income today is it's $60,000 a year now. So like how expensive everything is matters a lot. If you're making 26 grand in 1982, you were doing just fine. If you're making 26 grand right now, you're on the poverty line because of how much things cost. So nominal wages staying the same, price goes up, means real wages goes down. The same with nominal and real GDP. If nominal GDP stayed the same and everything got more expensive, then that means my real GDP would have been going down because it takes into account that inflation. Okay, D. As a result of the increase in exports, export-oriented industries in Andersonland increase expenditures, that's just spending, on new container ships and equipment. Which component of aggregate demand will change? This has one of the silliest things for students that I've seen them mess up here, is they either just rush so fast through this question that they don't read D, and they just put net exports, or they just see the word increase in exports and their mind blanks out for 5 seconds and they just write net exports here. Read it. It says that the businesses in Andersonland increased spending on new container ships and equipment. Businesses spending more on things that help them produce stuff is investment spending. Which component of aggregate demand is it? It's investment. It's investment spending that we're talking about. Your components of AD are C, I, G, X, N. It's not net exports. Initially in this problem, yes, this is net exports. But it's telling you in D, wait a minute, read. They increase expenditures on new container ships and equipment. So that'll increase aggregate demand. But specifically, it'll increase the investment spending part of it. Okay. What is the impact on the LRAS curve? All right. So based on what I told you in the last slide, you should have an actual answer to this. It's weird to see on the AP exam because, and this is going to be really stupid, the answer here could have been any of 3 possible things. It could have been increase, decrease, or stay the same. That's very stupid. At least from like a you having to deal with it standpoint. Doesn't mean you automatically get the point for it because it was all based on the explanation. So let's go through them. Not changing long aggregate supply. Sure. Fine. If you want to say that, you can kind of get away with it because in the long run it'll self-correct would be like my logic here. We were at full employment. It will just go back to like the LRAS line in the long run, so you wouldn't actually be able to produce more in the long term. So you could go that route. I think the best answer here is that it increases because you have acquired more capital stock. Like these things help you produce things not just now but forever. Investment spending is a thing that leads to more capital stock, which capital stock is what changes the long run aggregate supply curve. So I would say the long aggregate supply should increase because the increases in investment spending should lead to a higher level of capital stock within this economy, raising its full employment level of output. That'd be my full answer to 2 if I was answering it. If I was a grader, that's what I would want to see. The decrease bit has to do with interest rates and businesses borrowing more money to buy more container ships and equipment. I don't know why they gave kids the point for that. I don't know why kids would assume that's happening. That seems like 2 steps further down the road than you would need to think. So I thought that was weird. Increase is the best answer. Not change is probably okay. Decrease technically was allowed, but the explanation there was like you had to write like a full paragraph for the decrease explanation for it to make any sense. For no change, you didn't have to write very much. For increasing, you still don't kind of have to write it very much, but it does make the most sense. So there are some questions on the AP exam like that where, depending on your explanation, you could get the point or not, because there can be more than one way to answer questions. Sometimes some of you guys that are really good at this class have sort of recognized in problems that if you go down the rabbit hole enough, it might all like fall apart and undo itself, which freaks you out. But if you were to kind of write your way through that, they might give you the point for it, because you're not wrong a lot of the time when you think that. Okay. So this is technically out of order for my class in terms of which graphs we covered in which sequence, but I'm going to hit the Phillips curve now. Normally, the money market, loanable funds market came between the aggregate demand supply curve and the Phillips curve, but I'm going to hit the Phillips curve now because the Phillips curve and the aggregate demand supply curve are best friends, and they're doing the predator handshake all the time. So the graph is cut off here. I don't know why this visual does this. It's inflation rate as the y-axis, and SRPC is this downward sloping line. You don't need the numbers here. The numbers are just a hypothetical example. Pardon me. Okay. Now, the Phillips curve is built around a theory. The theory is unemployment and inflation are inversely related in the short run. That unemployment goes down to really low levels. You get very high levels of inflation because people have jobs and can spend, and spending causes inflation. It's called demand pull inflation. When unemployment's really, really, really high, people don't have jobs and can't spend, so inflation would be very low. That's the logic of the short run Phillips curve. Okay. Whenever you're doing a Phillips curve problem, 9 times out of 10, the problem is really an aggregate demand supply curve problem with an extra step. It is really just an aggregate demand supply curve with an extra step, because unemployment rate and inflation rate are based on my aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph stuff, because real GDP and price level have relationships to those 2 variables. So I'm using just like a nice, simple aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph like that. Just like a very basic one to help explain this. So the first thing listed here is that a change in aggregate demand causes a movement along the Phillips curve. What you can write here as like an additional thing is that the change in aggregate demand kind of proves Phillips' theory right. That if I were to say increase aggregate demand, say I use like the increase in exports from the last problem we did. If I increase aggregate demand, my real GDP would go up, right? And my price level would go up. Well, based on our relationship stuff, real GDP going up should cause unemployment rates to go down, because if businesses are producing more and making more money, they should be able to hire more workers, and higher GDP would tell me that businesses are making more money, probably. And if price level is going up, then inflation rate should be going up as well. So this is kind of how I do my Phillips curve stuff. So I draw a little quick aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, or for me, because I'm pretty good at it, I picture the aggregate demand supply graph a lot of the time. And then I write off to the side what happened to GDP, price level, and then what happens to unemployment and inflation rate, and I sort of circle or bold or highlight the unemployment and inflation rate bit, because that's what I gotta have happen on my Phillips curve. So like on this one, say we were at equilibrium here. Say we were there. And say this happens, say we get this lower level of unemployment and higher rate of inflation, well, that proves Phillips' theory right, that those 2 are inversely related. If I want lower unemployment, I go left. If I want higher inflation, I go up. Oh, looky, I can be on the curve still. So I'm moving from one point to the other on your Phillips curve. You do, for sure, need arrows when you're moving along a curve. If you give me 2 dots on the curve, I have no idea which of those came first. Unless you give me letters that the AP exam question tells you to give. If they don't give you that, you do need the arrow. Now, you should be drawing arrows for every shift on every graph anyway, just to be safe. You will straight up not get points here if you don't draw this arrow. Because as a grader, which one of those is first? Like the one at equilibrium? No, you don't have to start there. You don't always start at equilibrium here. So I don't know which of those is first. You have to give me the arrow. Okay, so movement in aggregate demand moves me along the Phillips curve. A change in aggregate supply will shift the entire Phillips curve because the change in aggregate supply proves Phillips theory wrong. The stagflation of the 70s is what dunked on Phillips theory. So he was like, ha ha ha, they're inversely related. And then stagflation happened, which is when you have both inflation and unemployment going up. And Phillips like, oh, wait, what? You shouldn't be able to have that. And they're like, yeah, okay, buddy. They did. Sucks to be you. Okay. So if I increase aggregate supply, I would get a higher level of real GDP, but I would get a lower price level. If it's easier for businesses to make things, things will be typically lower cost for us. So the higher GDP gets me a lower unemployment rate, and the lower price level gets me a lower inflation rate. So again, this is the kind of thing that I'm doing every time with the Phillips curve problem. If I see the word Phillips curve, I'm like, here we go. Let's write out this bit because I'm going to have to do this anyway. So lower unemployment, lower inflation. Cool. I can't move along the curve to prove that. Phillips theory is wrong. Say I'm starting here again with this dot. If I want lower of both, I got to move down and in, and I'm not going to like stand out in the void. Do you have to draw both graphs to get the points? On a Phillips curve problem that's only asking you to draw the Phillips curve, no. A lot of times in Phillips curve problems, they will only ask you to draw one graph, Jesus. So that's a good question. You wouldn't have to draw both. I just would like off to the side or on the like question paper where they just have the questions and you don't put your answers there. I would just sketch the aggregate demand supply graph over there. That's a good question though. Unless they ask you to draw both, you do not have to draw both. You only have to draw whatever they ask you to draw. So like that is what's happening when I increase aggregate supply. The thing for both of these that is very helpful to know is that you're always going in opposite directions of your aggregate demand supply curve. Like I shifted my aggregate supply to the right, so I shift my Phillips curve to the left. I moved my aggregate demand to the right, so I moved along my Phillips curve to the left. So they go in opposite directions. If I increase AD, I move along left. If I decrease AD, I move along right. If I increase aggregate supply, I shift the line left. If I decrease aggregate supply, I shift the line right. So you got to know one shifts along, one shifts the line, but they both do opposite direction stuff compared to your aggregate demand supply curve. That will save you time. That's the way to save you time on those questions. The only weird one, and this is the like 9 out of 10 times it's an aggregate demand supply problem, the 1 time out of 10 where it's not is when it's a change in expected inflation rate. And this one is fairly simple. If we expect more inflation, we will cause more inflation regardless of whatever unemployment rate is at. If our unemployment rate is really low and you tell me there's a bunch more inflation happening, I'm going to spend more. If unemployment rate is really high and you tell me there's a bunch of inflation, I'm still going to spend more. So if I expect more inflation, I get more inflation across the board. So I would shift my SRPC up. If I expect less inflation, I would shift my SRPC down. That's it. Now, technically speaking, this is technically affecting both aggregate supply and aggregate demand at the same time. I wouldn't want to do move along and then move the line. That's a lot of logic to have to deal with, especially since something's going to be kind of indeterminate there. Just move the whole line. It'll save you a bunch of effort. They might not say upward. They might say outward. That's fine. You are still moving the graph outward. They might say rightward. That is still technically correct. The line is moving out, right, up. The point's technically moving up, but they won't always phrase it like that. Okay, so that's like your short run Phillips curve stuff, moving the SRPC. The LRPC is the Philip was wrong line, which says that in the long run, given enough time, it doesn't super matter what the inflation rate is. You'll kind of always be toggling back to this specific unemployment rate, which is called the natural rate of unemployment, or the NIRU. It is, if everything else in your economy is going great, what should your unemployment rate be at? It's what is full employment for your economy. Because this is important to understand for like real life purposes. Full employment isn't 0% unemployment. It is at an ideal level of unemployment. And that ideal level for us is built off of what our structural and our frictional unemployment are at. Those are the two good types of unemployment. Like frictional is you're moving from place to place, career to career, college to workforce. Like you should be unemployed for a window there. That's fine. That's good. And structural is unemployment when your skills kind of become obsolete, which is still good unemployment for the economy because skills do become obsolete over time. Like VHSs aren't popular. DVDs don't matter anymore. So if you were a repairman for those guys, that job doesn't matter. It's a bummer, but it doesn't matter. We got to try and progress as an economy and get better at stuff. So that's structural unemployment. So having those two, totally fine. If you add up all of your structural and frictional, you get the natural rate, which is where your LRPC is at. So like LRPC, just like LRAS, is a visual reference for full employment. It is full employment's here. I don't care about what the inflation rate is. I'm telling you, regardless of whatever the inflation rate is, if everyone who should be working is working, you'd be at this number. That's what's going on there. Now, because of that, because LRPC is kind of like LRAS in that it is pretty much the exact same thing as the LRAS, you can also show the gaps on here. Recessionary, inflationary, positive, and negative, you can show it. In a recession, you've got a lot of unemployment and typically lower inflation. So that would be starting here. You don't label these on your test as point B, C, or A. I'm just giving you a one graph to save me time. So if your point is further down the curve than LRPC, you're in a recession. If your point is further up the curve than LRPC, you're in an inflationary gap, which you shouldn't have to think that hard on this because the axes give it away. A recession is a time period where you have a lot of unemployment. A lot of unemployment relative to what is a good question. A lot of unemployment relative to your full employment level. Like if you have more unemployment than you should have, which this line, this green line here is how much I should have. Well, I've got more than that. Oh, unemployment's my x-axis. Oh, so I'm to the right. That's a recession. Okay, got it. And then my inflationary gap, I have more inflation than I should have. Well, my expected inflation rate, like what inflation should be, is whatever it is here. Because this is where I'm supposed to be, so that's what inflation should be at. And whoop, I'm up here. Uh-oh. I got more inflation than I'm supposed to have. If they tell you the words, the expected inflation rate is this, they are referring to the inflation rate at equilibrium. Like whenever you're at long-run equilibrium, this is the expected inflation rate. Because that's assuming your economy is going well. It's expected because like this is, if everything else is going great, your inflation should be here. And it's like, but what if it's not? And you're like, whoops, I don't know. Uh-oh. Right. Archer is currently sleeping. No, you heard me. No! He knows his name. Didn't mean to wake you up, buddy. Sorry. He was sleeping in his bed. Good boy. You can go back to napping. You're doing great. All right. It's like you're talking a lot. It's like, yeah, I'm talking a lot. All right. So Phillips curve practice. This one, not doing an FRQ for this. There's an FRQ next, but this is just to confirm with you guys that you know what the heck is going on. These are all either aggregate demand or aggregate supply shifts. It's all following the same template. You've got to know what the scenario does to inflation and unemployment, and then it'll tell you what to do to the Phillips curve. So like an increase in government spending is an increase in aggregate demand. We already drew that. You have higher inflation, you get lower unemployment, because if we're spending more, then businesses should be able to hire more. If it's showing this inverse relationship, I'm moving along the Phillips curve, and if I'm getting higher inflation and lower unemployment, I should be, if I'm imagining that curve, going up the curve, because going up the curve would have higher inflation. Increase in overall productivity means that we're capable of producing more. That is supply. It's our ability to produce things is aggregate supply. So increase supply. Increased aggregate supply, I already did this one. I get lower inflation and lower unemployment. So I shift the Phillips curve down. I'm taking the entire curve and moving it down. Already drew that one. Increase in income taxes. Aggregate demand or aggregate supply. Income taxes doesn't really matter to our ability to produce stuff, because I don't know, like, what does that do to businesses' ability to make things? Does it affect our ability to spend? Yeah, it for sure affects my ability to spend. If I'm getting taxed more, I can't spend as much. So that's a decrease in aggregate demand. If I decrease AD, finger graph time. If I decrease aggregate demand, well, I get a lower price level, so lower inflation. If I decrease aggregate demand, I usually get lower GDP, so higher unemployment, which would be moving down along the SRPC. Because if I'm imagining the Phillips curve, I want lower inflation, I'm moving down. I want higher unemployment, I'm moving to the right. Oh, down and right is following the curve, because the curve is downward sloping. And an increase in the cost of oil. Oil is a natural resource. This will affect our ability to produce things more than anything else. So decrease in aggregate supply. I'd get higher inflation and higher unemployment if I'm moving my supply curve to the left. I'm moving my Phillips curve to the right. So moving it down, slash, I'm moving it right, slash, up, but I'm really moving it rightward. The direction of your arrows will probably not matter. It shouldn't matter. As long, like from like moving the line left to right, do I draw like a down arrow, an up arrow, a right, or a left? As long as you draw the line in the right spot and then draw an arrow from your starting line to the new line, you'll be just fine. Okay, FRQ time. So, double checking this question real quick. All right, so assume the economy of Hopeton is currently in long-run equilibrium with a natural rate of unemployment equal to 5% and an inflation rate of 2%. So again, if I'm doing this on my AP exam, I know it's annoying to write the full word unemployment rate. Like, I get it. Like, man, life is short. Writing the word unemployment is a long part of my life. I can't believe you're making me do it, Mr. McRitchie. Yeah, sorry, bummer. Write the word. Don't abbreviate your axes. Just be safe. You don't want to have the grader who's really annoying about this. Okay, so we are at long-run equilibrium. It tells me that. It tells me that the natural rate is 5% and the inflation rate is 2%. Let me quickly answer a question in the chat that I've got. Krishnov asked, why would increasing the cost of oil decrease supply? Because oil is a natural resource that more affects businesses' abilities to produce things than it does affect my spending. Like, I go to the gas station kind of regardless, right? Like, I got to fill up to go home, to go wherever, okay? It's not really affecting aggregate demand because it's one good being more expensive doesn't change my spending levels really as a whole. But that good being oil will be an input cost for every single business in America because every business ships stuff. Whether it's ship their goods just to the market, they've got to pay for transportation, and oil is a part of that. It's why energy costs is a part of supply shifts, because that will affect every business's ability to produce things because it's a natural input cost they got to deal with regardless. Remember that oil prices skyrocketing is what caused the stagflation of the 70s, and stagflation is a decrease in supply, not a decrease in demand. In fairness, it probably would affect your aggregate demand a little bit, but it would for sure affect aggregate supply a whole lot. And to be clear, there seems to be like a sustained increase in oil prices, not just like, oh, today it's $2.67 and it was $2.62 yesterday, so stagflation? No, it has to be like by a decent amount for a while, not just like a one-day blip. The AP exam is not going to be nitpicky on that, though. So, here's my graph. Oh, and the point is R. That's what it says. It'll indicate a point as point R. So I got inflation rate, unemployment rate, LRPC, SRPC, 5% for the unemployment rate, 2% for the inflation rate. Again, it gave me numbers. If it gives you numbers to put on your graph, put those numbers on your graph. Put them there. Put them there. Stop hiding them. Put them there. Okay, on your graph, draw the long Phillips curve, label it LRPC. Boom, already did it. It goes right through point R because I'm at long run equilibrium. Easy point there. C. Assume that the government of Hopeton increases spending to finance repairs and maintenance of the country's infrastructure. How will such an increased spending affect unemployment and inflation in the short run? So this is where, Jesus, your question about do we need to draw the graphs comes into play. It's an FRQ. C here is absolutely an aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph question. It does not tell me to graph it. I don't have to graph it, but I kind of will have to explain it anyway. I'm going to have to kind of write it out regardless. So this increase in spending, what will it do to unemployment and inflation rate? Well, I know what it's going to do to my aggregate demand supply curve. An increase in government spending, increase in G, is an aggregate demand shift. So I would see an increase in aggregate demand. It doesn't ask that. It asks what will happen to unemployment and inflation rate. But I kind of want to reference the graph because it'll help me explain it. I would say an increase in government spending will increase aggregate demand, driving up real GDP. As real GDP rises, unemployment rate should fall as businesses now have more money and can afford to hire more workers. Unemployment rate, check. Additionally, that increase in spending should increase prices, which will subsequently increase inflation rate. So you should have a lower unemployment rate and a higher inflation rate. Period. End of answer. Basically, I took the entire graph thing I was doing before, put it into words instead, because it didn't ask me to graph it, it asked me to write it. I'm just taking what I'm doing on the graph and putting it out in words. It's why not just knowing that GDP and unemployment are inversely related, but understanding why is important. Because the question asked, what'll happen to unemployment and inflation rate? So if you just said that unemployment would go down and inflation would go up, you would get a point. But the second point for C is for explaining it. And in order to explain it, you kind of have to be saying aggregate demand went up, so real GDP is going up. And if real GDP goes up, then businesses can hire more workers, so unemployment goes down. And price levels going up, so inflation rate's going up. And you could even say because the definition of inflation is an overall increase in price level, they don't need you to explain that one as much because it's the definition. So I got lower unemployment, higher inflation, and then D asks me to draw that on my Phillips curve. So I'm starting at point R. I have lower unemployment and higher inflation. Remember, I increased aggregate demand is what I said. If I'm increasing aggregate demand, meaning I'm moving my aggregate demand curve to the right, I would be moving along my Phillips curve because aggregate demand, and I'd be moving to the left because I moved my aggregate demand to the right. So like that, point S to point R. I'm also going to dotted line out my equilibrium here. Technically, didn't tell me to do it. Technically, I don't care. Do it every time. You'll never forget to do it. Unemployment 1, inflation 1, that's fine. I don't know what those rates are, but I know that U1 is less than 5. I know that I1 is greater than 2. And then E, last question here. Following the increase in government spending, workers demand and receive a higher wage. Okay, so government spent more. We start paying our workers more. Great. What will happen to the SRPC as a result of the higher wage? This is also an aggregate demand supply question. This is just like C, except it isn't asking about unemployment and inflation rate. It's asking about the Phillips curve itself. So I will probably have to do basically everything I did in C, and then at the very end say which will increase or decrease my Phillips curve or move it along the curve. Like I'll have to add that on. But I'm going to go through the full same explanation process I did in C, basically. It wouldn't make sense for me to not, because it says explain here. So we are paying our workers more. Paying our workers more. The word wage is a good hint here. Wage is an input cost. It is a supply shifter. If it just said consumers' income goes up, and then I could think this is a demand thing. But if I see wages, I'm thinking supply. Because wages is how much businesses got to pay their workers, and they got to pay their workers more. If you're a business and you're paying your workers more, you can't produce as much. It's a higher input cost. So aggregate supply is going down. So let's explain this for the answer. Due to the higher wages, businesses should not be able to produce as much, so short-run aggregate supply should decrease, period. As a result of the decrease in aggregate supply, price levels should rise, which will drive up inflation, and GDP should fall, which will lead to a higher unemployment rate, because if businesses are paying their workers more, they won't be able to afford as many of those workers, period. With a higher inflation and a higher unemployment rate, we should see the short-run Phillips curve shift rightward/outward/upward as a result of the higher inflation and unemployment rate. That's the full answer. About 3 sentences, probably would have been a total about 5 lines of text for that, which is pretty decent. It's not a short answer, but it's not an essay, it's not a DBQ, it's not like you're writing a thesis and then contextualization stuff. You're just writing like what's happening, which is businesses got to pay their workers more, prices are going to go up, unemployment's going to go up because if they're paying the workers more, they got to lay some people off. So my Phillips curve shifting up or out. That's what's happening for that one. So these questions for explanations, yeah, explain it. Like, stop trying to write a sentence and think that that's a good enough explanation. How does that make sense? You got to like really spell it out for the grader. You got to tell them what it is. Got to tell them how it works. So that's your Phillips curve question. Technically speaking, what you did graph here was a long-run self-adjustment on the Phillips curve. If you drew all of C through E, which you weren't necessarily supposed to, you would have gone back up. What other shifters are there? Ty, I assume you're referring to the Phillips curve shifters. It's a change in aggregate demand and a change in aggregate supply are your 2 main shifters, but the other one was a change in expected inflation rate. Those are the 3 things that change your Phillips curve. For aggregate supply, if that's what you're talking about, because I was talking about that just then, it is input costs, it is productivity. That's like the 2 big things. If it costs more to produce stuff, you can't produce as much. Whether that be wages, whether that be oil, whether that be more regulations or like minimum wages going up. Like if it costs you more to make stuff, you can't make as much stuff. If your workers are more productive, you could produce more. If they're less productive, you produce less. Remember that it's more important that you just understand what the lines are. That will help you know the shifters. Cool. I think that covered it for you, Ty. All right. Home stretch here. We have 3 left. Yes. 3 graphs left. We are doing amazing on time. This might not take 4 hours. I am incredible at talking fast and blowing through this. Also, normally on this kind of 4-hour thing, I would pause, have you answer the question, and then go through it. But with like 15 viewers, I'm not going to do that. No offense to you guys that are here. It's just a matter of like, if I was in an 80-person lecture hall, we would be pausing and stuff more. But with you guys just in the chat, we're good. Okay, the money market, or the supply and demand of money. This is the market for money in your economy, conceptually. Now, your y-axis is nominal interest rate. Your x-axis, this should just say quantity of money. This is just the best graph visually I could find on the internet for it. But how we've been drawing it is the same shape and line. S, M, D, M is probably fine. I write the supply of money and demand of money. X-axis is quantity of money. Y-axis is nominal interest rate. Again, don't abbreviate stuff. I'm only shortening it here because I don't have space to draw it on my whiteboard. You've got an equilibrium level of interest rate and an equilibrium quantity. Like so. Okay. The money supply is M1, which is the amount of money held by consumers in the form of cash, as well as the amount of money held in bank deposits. It is changed solely and pretty much only by the Fed, the central bank. Monetary policy. Monetary policy changes the money supply. Monetary policy changes the money supply. Monetary policy changes the money supply. I put my mic close to my mouth there because kids are all messed that up quite a bit. I don't know how. I don't know why. It's like the only thing they do. It's like the entire job of the Fed is to regulate the money supply. So if I see the words the Fed or the central bank in a question, you know what I'm going to think? Money supply. It's the money supply every time. It's always the money supply. Guys, come on. Okay. Now, if you forget how these work, and don't worry about the TAF, they've gotten rid of that on the AP exam. College, it exists in the real world, but the AP exam doesn't ask about it anymore. This refers to changes in the reserve requirement or the required reserve ratio, changes in open market operations, which are the buying and selling of bonds, and changes in the discount rate. Reserve ratio is the percentage of your deposit, so a lower reserve ratio would mean an expansionary monetary policy because banks could lend more, so money supply goes up. Higher reserve requirement would decrease the money supply because banks can't lend as much. The Federal Reserve buying bonds is expansionary because the Fed buying those bonds means that they are buying them from the public, so people are going to have more actual cash now, more liquid assets. The Fed selling bonds is contractionary because that means that people and banks are buying those bonds from the Fed, so they will have less spendable cash right now, so the money supply would be going down. For the discount rate, which is the price of a loan from the Fed to regular banks, if the discount rate is higher, banks can't get as much money from the Fed because it costs them more to do that, so that's contractionary. If the discount rate is lower, then banks can borrow more from the Fed because it's cheaper. For those three things, if you know the definitions of it, you'll be able to figure out if it's expansionary or contractionary a lot. If you just refuse to know what discount rate is, you're going to struggle with it every time. Learn it. Memorize it. It's a word. It just means the price of a loan from the Fed to banks. As it. Okay, the demand for money. This one is so important. Didn't mean to slap. Sorry, clap was too loud. The demand for money is how badly people want to have their wealth in the form of cash. It's how badly you want to have spendable money on hand right now, which is good to know. It's this whole thing right here. Because at a lower interest rate, you would rather have cash because investing your money, like putting it in a bond or a stock or your savings account, isn't as worthwhile to you at those super low interest rates because it's not really making you money. At really high interest rates, though, you wouldn't want to have much spendable money. I'd rather have basically all of my wealth in the form of an asset. I'd rather have bonds or stocks or a savings account that I'm just loading the hell out of because at a really high interest rate, I am making an insane amount of money. Basically, at high interest rates, there's a great incentive to put cash into savings accounts, is a good way to think about it. At a low interest rate, there isn't that much of an incentive, so you would rather have cash then. The supply curve is always vertical because the interest rate doesn't matter to the money supply. The demand curve shifts when there's changes in things like GDP, income, and price level because if you have more money, you spend more money, which means you have more spendable money. So increase in GDP or income would increase the demand for money. Decrease in GDP or income would decrease the demand for money because you don't have as much spendable money if you're poorer. That's just how that works. And for price level, if everything is more expensive, then you would need to have more spendable money on hand to just pay for the same things as before. So higher demand for money. If price level is lower, you wouldn't need as much spendable money. So demand for money is lower. That's it. For this graph, the money supply changes if the Federal Reserve does frickin' anything. If the Federal Reserve breathes, the money supply changes. Okay, so I cut this FRQ in half because the second half of it is a thing we can do later. Actually, wait, I think this might have just been a... Yeah, no, that's fine. No, this was a short FRQ. It only had part A, B, and C because part B is longer than it looks. So, we've got an economy with no international sector. What the hell does that mean, Mr. McRitchie? It means they don't import or export anything. Does that matter, Mr. McRitchie? No. For this question specifically, no. For the real world, I mean, yes, that'd be super weird. But for this question, it doesn't change anything. Quick labeled money market graphs show how a decrease in the money supply will affect interest rates. This is literally taken from an AP exam question. It didn't even ask you about a monetary policy. It literally just told you, hey, dog, we'll give you a point if you draw the right graph. We'll give you another point if you move its supply curve left. People still mess that up. So money market graph. I got nominal interest rates. I know it's a lot of letters. It's really annoying that you got to write the words nominal interest rate and Q money. I'm sorry, guys. Like, life's hard sometimes. Capital Q does always mean quantity, so you are allowed and it's accepted to abbreviate quantity as capital Q. that is allowed, that is officially allowed. The AP exam has been clear about that over the years. They aren't always clear about what other things you can abbreviate. So here's my graph. Look at that. Boom. Nominal interest rate, quantity of money, QE, that doesn't matter if I did IE or not. Supply of money, demand for money. Boom. It told me there's a decrease in the money supply. Draw it, please, sir. Okay. Supply of money falls. Okay. Move the supply curve to the left. Show how that affects interest rates. Can do. I'll show you one better. I'll show you how it affects quantity of money too. I decrease the money supply, I get a higher interest rate, I get a lower quantity of money. So here's what's happening. If there's less money in our economy, banks will have less and will start charging more for loans, because if they don't have as much money to lend, they're going to need to make more money off of each individual loan. So they'll start charging more. It will also mean that there's less total money in our economy. That's why the quantity is going down. That's what's happened there. They could have used real monetary policies for A. They could have said the Fed is raising the discount rate, the Fed is raising the reserve requirement, the Fed is selling bonds. All of those are contractionary. B. This is a weird one. I've never seen this on any other AP exam question, but it's a good thing to put with this because it's a good, think. Explain how the change in interest rate to identified in Part A will directly affect each of the three components of aggregate demand for this closed economy. Things to freak you out there. Explain how it'll affect it gross. Each of the three components of aggregate demand? But Mr. McRitchie, aren't there four? Yes, normally there are four, unless, of course, you don't trade, because the four are C, I, G, X, N. Net exports would assume that you're buying things from other countries, and this country, for whatever reason, I guess just to add a layer of difficulty, because the rest of this question is kind of easy, doesn't trade. There is no international sector here. They're a closed economy. They do not trade with anybody, which is fine because it would have been weird to explain how the interest rate affected net exports. I would have had to write quite a bit to get there. But I got to explain how it affects consumption spending, investment spending, and government spending. Now, you should instantly be able to explain the investment spending one. Luckily for you guys, the investment and the consumption spending one are kind of the same, and frankly, so is the government one, because the reason why high interest rates will decrease your aggregate demand, because that's what it does, it decreases AD, is because, and it's the same explanation for all three of them, a higher interest rate makes loans more expensive. So consumers cannot borrow and spend as much on things like homes and cars, even though those are technically counted as investment spending. They would have been fine here. Businesses cannot borrow and spend as much on things like capital or factories and stuff like that. And the government cannot borrow and spend as much because it costs them significantly more to borrow. So I would say all three of those would decrease. They had an option where you could write that government spending wouldn't change. They gave that as a caveat of you can write that G doesn't change because the government kind of borrows regardless of what the interest rate is, which is accurate, but normally if they behave logically and rationally, they probably shouldn't borrow as much if the interest rates are higher. But for all three of these, because loans are more expensive, consumers shouldn't be able to borrow and spend as much, businesses shouldn't be able to borrow and spend as much, the government shouldn't be able to borrow and spend as much. It's the same explanation for all three. It's why, even though it says directly affect each of the three components, you would have been able to get away with reusing the same explanation for all three, because it's the same explanation for all three. Okay? And then using a quickly labeled aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph. Okay. It doesn't tell me to draw LRAS, and it also doesn't tell me if they're at full employment or not. So I don't actually have to draw LRAS. You will draw LRAS if they ask you. You will draw LRAS if they tell you that this economy is at full employment, if they are in a recession, if they are in an inflationary gap. If they tell you anything about what this economy is currently dealing with, you should draw LRAS. They are not telling me that at all here. So I kind of can't draw it because I don't really know what's happening to it. But I already gave it away. I have my aggregate demand supply graph fully labeled and beautiful. Look at how beautiful that graph is. And I mentioned that that change in interest rate, that higher interest rate should get me lower consumption, lower investment, lower government spending, all of them, which just means I should get a decrease in aggregate demand. So I get PL lower, Y1 lower, done. Now again, on my answer, when I'm like formatting it for the AP exam, I would write letter A, draw my money market graph, and I would say C graph for A. For B, I would write my full explanation. That's all I've got to do there. And then C, I would draw the aggregate demand supply graph, and then I would also write like CI. I'd write that output falls just to be safe. And for CII, I would write that price level falls for, again, the same exact reason. Matt, I see your question. I'm going to answer it here in a second. So I would like draw my graph, and I would still even write the CI and II thing just to be like, I know you can see it on the graph. I know that's what you're grading me on. I know I don't need to write this. Screw it. Let me just write it anyway. Okay, Matt asked, could you always draw the LRAS regardless? So here's the deal. I don't think they would care if you did or did not here. If you drew it through the middle at the start, they probably would have been just fine. The problem I would have with that, Matt, I don't know if this economy is at full employment or not, right? It doesn't tell me anything about that. It doesn't tell me if they're at full employment, if they were in a recession, or if they were in an inflationary gap. Like, I guess you could assume that they were in an inflationary gap because that's when they should have decreased the money supply, but I don't know that. I just don't. They didn't give me enough context to know. The LRAS is always built on context, so you have to know what this economy is dealing with before I can even really draw the long-run aggregate supply curve. So that's the only reason why I wouldn't have drawn it here, is because I don't actually know where it is. I feel like if you drew it through the middle, they wouldn't have cared one way or the other, but it gets nitpicky at that point of like, I don't know if you even actually could know where LRAS is here, so I wouldn't have drawn it. Hopefully that makes sense. It's one of those things where it's like, I don't know where to draw it, so I'm not going to draw it yet. All right. Loanable funds market. All right. Which I also write this as the quantity of loans and the supply and demand of loans, as opposed to the quantity of loanable funds and the supply and demand of loanable funds, but the AP exam is pretty chill about it. So would you only draw the LRS when they specifically say in the text? No, I wouldn't only do it if they specifically told me to draw it. I would only draw it if I knew where to draw it. If that makes sense. Because they don't always tell you in a question to draw LRS. Let me look here. Like, this one does, but on a question like this, let me make my head smaller. This is the Anderson Land FRQ did already. Sometimes they don't always tell you to draw this here. Just they say to draw like the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. But if they have this statement here, I will be drawing LRAS. This statement is what tells me to draw LRAS. It's not that it tells me to draw it here. Like, I'm going to definitely notice the draw it there, but like they could not have this thing here at all. Because of that, I will draw LRAS. If they tell me that I'm in a recession, if they tell me that I'm in an inflationary gap, if they tell me anything along those lines, like if they say, you've got more unemployment than you should have. Okay, well, it's a recession, so I should draw it. You have more inflation than expected. That's an inflationary gap. Like, if they give me any context, which they do a lot of the time, they didn't on this one, right? There isn't really that context here. It's just telling me that they don't trade. But if they give me the context, I'm drawing LRAS, for sure. Good questions, guys. It's a good thing to ask about. Thank you. I draw what I know to draw. And if I know where LRS would be in a situation, I'm going to draw LRS in a situation. Okay, loanable funds market graph. Market for loans, supply and demand of loans. The supply of loans is banks' ability to lend. How much money can banks loan out? That's tied a lot to savings, because the more you save more in the bank. It's also tied to things like capital flow, where money flowing into your economy from another country would lead to banks having more money, so a greater supply of loanable funds. Or expected profitability of loaning. This is not a normal thing to see, but it is a technically correct shifter, where if banks believe that they can make a bunch of money off of loans here, say that like somehow like credit scores improve nationally, meaning people are significantly more reliable payers of debt, banks would be more willing to lend, right? If I'm a bank and I'm like, man, everyone's so good at paying off their loans, I'm going to loan out to them all the freaking time because I'm constantly getting paid. No one's defaulting on it. I don't have to like knock, foreclose on their home and stuff. Like, that's a pain. If everyone's got good credit, I would be more willing to lend. So stuff like that. Banks are the supplier of loans here. So when you're seeing the loan market graph, think supply, banks, supply, banks, supply, banks. I'm a bank. Does this let me supply more or less loans? Yes. Oh, supply goes up. That's what you're thinking. Demand of loans is a little weird too, because it's not just consumers' demand for loans. We aren't the only ones who borrow. Borrowers include businesses who borrow all the time to pay for capital and stuff like that, and for the government, because they borrow literally all the time to pay for kind of anything they do in America, because we are in a massive deficit. So equilibrium is right where your real interest rate equals the amount of dollars that have been saved / invested. Because if it's either saved or invested into the bank, it is part of that supply of loanable funds. So if you see that phrase, don't freak out. It's just like the amount of dollars saved is the supply, the amount of dollars being invested or demanded is the demand. Don't freak out there. And then again, the things that shifted: demand, business opportunities, because if businesses think they can make a lot of money, they'd want to spend and borrow more to capitalize on that. So like businesses are like, ooh, now's a good time to expand. Cool. Demand for loans goes up, because if businesses think that they can expand a bunch, they're going to want to borrow and spend more to do it. So greater demand for loans. Government spending is the biggest demand shifter here. Specifically, deficit spending. If the government is having to borrow to finance its spending, which is most of the time when you do an expansionary policy, you're going to have to borrow to pay for that spending. If they're doing that, then, and only then, will I change the demand for loanable funds. But I will absolutely change that demand. If the government is borrowing more, the demand goes up. If the government is borrowing less, the demand goes down. Now, caveat. Government borrowing can be seen as or drawn as a supply shifter, because for some people, the view of this graph is the amount of money that can be lent to the people, to the public, basically, to the private sector, to not the government. So if your view is from that context, from that point of view, that like this is the amount of money that people have access to, the government borrowing more would decrease the supply of loans, because then banks wouldn't be able to lend as much to me and you. So you might see, if you look it up on other videos, that teachers draw it as a decrease in supply. I draw it as a decrease in demand. The AP exam allows for both, because both are correct. It just depends on how you define this market, which varies person to person annoyingly. Okay. Loanable funds market, FRQ. We are almost done. We have this one in the Forex market, and then we're done with all the graphs that you have to know, and then we get to the models and stuff. Okay. Loanable funds market in Country X is currently in equilibrium. Okay. It doesn't say long run equilibrium because there isn't a long run on this graph. Pardon me. Supply of loans, demand of loans, real interest rate, equilibrium. It says to label the equilibrium interest rate as R asterisk or R star, and the quantity of funds as QF star or asterisk. So I'll do that. That's just fine. So here's my graph. Supply of loans, demand for loans, quantity of loans, quantity QF star P or R star, real interest rate is my Y. So yes, loanable funds market has real interest rate as your y-axis. Money market has nominal interest rate as your y-axis. The easiest way for me to remember that is that interest rate is really the price of a loan and not the price of money. So interest rates are really the price of a loan, real interest rate, not the price of money, so it's nominal, money. That's how I tend to think of it. So, assume that the government of Country X, which had a balanced budget, they were doing so good. The amount of money they were spending was exactly the same as their tax revenue. They had freaking nailed it. They botched it. Now it increases their spending while holding their taxes constant. They are not changing taxes, they are increasing spending, meaning the government has to fund that spending with borrowing, which the question tells you, which is beautiful that it tells you that. The AP exam is spoon feeding you like a little baby. Here you go, here's your little food. Because you need to know that if the government is spending more and not taxing more, they're going to have to borrow, which you should have already known that. But it's nice they told you. Okay, first question, not a graph question. Look at this. BI is not a graph question. It's a gotta write your answer question. What will be the impact of this policy action on their budget balance? What's the budget balance? It's referring to, is this government in a deficit or is it in a budget surplus? Which that should be kind of easy to figure. They were in a balanced budget, which meant that government spending was equal to tax revenue. They just increased spending while holding taxes constant, so government spending is now greater than tax revenue. And if government spending is greater than tax revenue, you are in a deficit. Sorry for all the clicking. But if you're spending more than you're bringing in, you're in a deficit. If you were spending more money than you were making, you would be in debt. Deficit, debt, there you go. Okay, on your graph, show how this affects the interest rate and the quantity of funds. So again, for me, I draw this as an increase in demand, but the AP exam was specific on this and is always specific on this, that an increase in demand or a decrease in supply is allowed. So I draw an increase in demand, which gives me a higher quantity. The higher quantity there means that there is a total higher amount of money being loaned out, is how I interpret this graph. The higher real interest rate, because if the government wants to borrow more, banks are going to start charging more for loans for not just the government, but for everybody, because it's all the same money for the bank. Doesn't matter who they're lending to. Given your answer in part B2, how will private sector interest-sensitive expenditures be affected? Private sector means like businesses. Interest-sensitive expenditures means spending tied to interest rates. So business spending that is tied to interest rates is investment spending. Because investment spending is tied to interest rates. This is just a hilariously fancy way of saying the word investment spending. It's trying to freak you out. Don't be freaked out by it. If it says interest-sensitive expenditures, that's spending. Interest-sensitive means it's a spending that's affected by interest rates. Interest rates went up. Every type of spending that's affected by interest rates would go down. We just did in the last question. Government spending was affected by it. Businesses being able to borrow and spend. Consumers is being able to spend. Whatever. It doesn't even say to explain it, which is great. I would still say my explanation before would work because loans are now more expensive. Businesses in the private sector will not be able to borrow and spend as much. Given your answer in part C, what will be the impact on the long-run growth rate of the economy? This is a Unit 5 concept. This is covered in about half of the class period in Unit 5 because it's not that complicated. What you need for long-run growth is a hell of a lot of capital. You need a bunch of tools, tech, machinery, things that help you produce stuff. If investment spending's going down, you won't have as much of that stuff. So the full explanation here would be long-run growth rate should decrease or slow down because the lower investment spending from Part C would lead to a lower amount of overall capital stock within your economy. You would have less things that allow you to produce more in the long term. It's capital stock's the big thing. Economic growth is always tied to capital stock. And delete. Oh, that's not it for the graphs. I don't know where my Forex market questions are. Give me 1 second. Let me make sure I grab that because I don't know why it's out of order on this PowerPoint. Why is that? Oh, because last year the Forex market wasn't on the AP exam. That's why it's not here. That was so stupid that they did that. Yeah, in case you're wondering, last year, because of the way the pandemic happened, they cut off Unit 6 from the AP exam for econ. So the Forex market wasn't on it. So this PowerPoint, which I built last year, I had the Forex market stuff hidden. I still have it, but I had it hidden. Oh, that's why it wasn't in that previous slide. It wasn't cut off. I had forgotten that the Forex market got cut off of last year's exam. Okay, Forex market, here we go. I made this graph, you don't always have like these different dots here. This is just to show you that you can have surpluses and shortages on this market, which is accurate. So the Forex market is the market for a currency. The way it always works, it is the quantity of a currency. So in this case, it is quantity of dollars, and the exchange rate. When you're writing it on the AP exam, you'll write it like this or like this, as yen per dollar or pesos per dollar or euros per dollar. The way you know how to draw it, the way you know how to label it, because that's always an issue on the Forex market for kids, is whatever your quantity is, like if it's the dollar graph, it's quantity of dollars. That'll be the last thing here. The denominator, or whatever as after per, will match your quantity. Because the amount of yen per dollar is the price of a dollar in terms of yen. It is how many yen it takes to get a dollar. That tells me how expensive a dollar is, the price. So you've got an equilibrium here. This one gives you numbers. I grabbed this from a textbook, but you could have a price above equilibrium, a price below equilibrium. Shortages and surpluses of currency do exist. Just creates weird market things that then have to balance themselves out. So, oh man. So whenever we're talking about the foreign exchange market, there's only really a handful of things you have to think about in terms of what will affect the foreign exchange market. I narrow it down to 2. This list is from College Board and it's a total of 4, but my 2 still work. My 2 are a change in the desire to import goods from another country and a change in relative interest rates. These are the 2 reasons why you would want another country's currency. Some examples of this were, if our goods are cheaper than the other country's goods, they're going to want to buy our goods, meaning they're going to want our currency. That'll increase the demand for dollars. Now, where this gets tricky for kids is that you are kind of thinking of 2 graphs every time you're doing a foreign exchange market, because you kind of have to think of both currencies graphs here. So I'm going to use the yen per dollar as my example because that's what this question gives me, or what this graph I grabbed off the internet gives me. Because making these graphs in a PowerPoint is kind of weird, so grabbing pictures of it's a little bit easier. So if I'm going through the logical example of like, they want to buy more of our stuff, I would have 2 graphs I'm thinking of. I would have a dollar graph, which is quantity of dollars, which is the bigger graph up here. And then I have a yen graph, which is quantity of yen and dollars per yen. So if they want to buy more of our stuff, that means they want more of our currency. Because like the American businesses don't want yen for their stuff. They're going to want dollars. So there is a higher demand for dollars now internationally. And for the yen, this would mean that people in Japan are supplying more of their currency internationally. They basically are pumping out more yen as a means of getting those dollars. So we have a higher demand for dollars and a higher supply of yen. This is always the pattern of how this graph worked. That it's supply of one, demand of the other, move them in the same direction every single time. Supply of one, demand of the other, same direction every single time. When the reason why the supply is increasing on yen is because the supply on this graph, like the supply of dollars here, isn't the amount of dollars that exist. It's the amount of dollars that are being exchanged internationally. The difference is that if we're trying to buy more goods from another country, we would be exchanging more dollars. We'd be swapping out more dollars. So there would be a greater supply of them internationally. If we don't want to exchange very much internationally, there'd be a lower supply of dollars internationally. So other reasons I mentioned inflation. If our inflation is less than theirs, that's kind of the exact same as one. Interest rate being higher is the big one. People tend to mess up here. That if our interest rate is really high, people will want to invest in us internationally. That if America had higher interest rates than Japan, the demand for the dollar would grow because people in Japan would want to invest in the United States. This is different than investment spending. Foreign investment and investment spending are different concepts. Let me finish my thing and then I'll answer Will's question. You would want to invest in the country with a higher interest rate because it gets you a higher rate of return off of investments like savings accounts and bonds and stocks and stuff. you don't have to worry about the high interest rate being a bad thing because you don't borrow money from other countries. So interest rates being the price of a loan doesn't hurt you internationally. The interest rate can't hurt you internationally. You're protected because you don't borrow. Okay, Will asked, would it be beneficial to do a graph of both currencies being compared, or would it just be a waste of time? I wouldn't call it a waste of time, but if you're a slower test taker, I probably wouldn't draw both. You should be thinking both, because a question could ask about either. Like if I give you the example of the interest rate is higher in America, I could ask you about the dollar graph, I could ask you about the yen graph. So you do have to know what's happening in both, Will. But you don't need to draw both on really any question over this, because even the FRQs will almost always only ask you to draw one of the markets, only either the dollar market or the yen market. But a question could ask you about either of them. That's why you have to know what's happening on both. So if there's a higher demand for dollars, there would be a higher supply of the other currency internationally. That causes the dollar to appreciate if people want more of our currency. If there's a higher demand for it, your currency's value is going up because, like, if demand goes up, the price goes up. It would take more yen to get a dollar at a higher level of demand, right? It'd be more yen per dollar, so the dollar is worth more in terms of yen. That matters when it comes to exports and imports, because if your currency appreciates, this came up in class a couple days ago, and your net exports will start to fall. So if your currency is worth more, you'll be able to buy more foreign goods, which rad, gotta love that. But if you buy more foreign goods, then you're importing more, which is kind of bad for your economy, because that means money's leaving it. That's why you don't love that as much. When your dollar depreciates, then your net exports would go up. So if a currency is depreciating, they'll be able to export more. If a currency is appreciating, they'll be able to export less. Just think of dollars as a good with a supply and demand graph. That's the easiest way to think about it. So no, technically speaking, you don't need to draw both currencies every time, but I'm always thinking about it as two graphs. I'm always thinking about it as I've got both currencies we're talking about. One of them is being demanded, one of them is being supplied. Go through the logical steps of that. Okay. So this is a double Forex market question. This is a question that hits both types of Forex market questions and hits a loanable funds market question. So we'll hit both here. This is like all of the international trade stuff in one FRQ. So we've got Japan, the EU, Canada, and Mexico. 4 countries. Oh my God, do I have to do 4 Forex market questions? No, it's 2 separate questions. Suppose Japan attracts an increased amount of investment from the EU, meaning people in the EU are investing in Japan. Money is coming from the EU to Japan. That's what that's telling me. The first thing it asks me to do is actually a loanable funds market graph. Okay. This is technically a capital flow problem, which is a Unit 6 thing. So it's loanable funds market for Japan. It's still just supply and demand of loans, quantity of loans, and real interest rate. It's not like Japan has a different name for their interest rate. It's still just the real interest rate for Japan. So it's just a normal loanable funds market graph. I then have to show the effect of the increased foreign investment on this graph. So I'm just setting it up real quick, like this. Normal loanable funds market graph. This is loanable funds. This is the graph before, but we'll get to the Forex market here in a second. So the increase in foreign investment on the real interest rate in Japan. So foreigners are investing more in Japan, meaning more money is coming into Japan. Japan has more money in Japan. Japan has more money. The banks of Japan would probably have more money. Supply goes up. This is a capital flow situation in which money from another country coming into your economy affects the supply of loanable funds, because if there's more money in your economy, then banks will have more money. It's not like those investors are borrowing. It's important to mention. They are investing, not borrowing from Japan. So this is not a demand shifter because there's not increased borrowing in Japan. There is an increased ability to lend in Japan because of that increased money coming from the EU. So higher supply, I get a lower real interest rate, and then double I asks, how will that real interest rate change in Japan affect the employment level in the short run? It says employment, not unemployment. That is tricky. But I've got a lower real interest rate here. So employment will actually go up. Why, you might ask? How do I know that? I know that because of how interest rates affect aggregate demand. Because when interest rates go down, we've mentioned it a couple of times in the last couple of FRQs, that as interest rates go down, investment spending goes up, right? Businesses can borrow and spend more now in Japan. Oh, wait a minute. If businesses can borrow and spend more, they could hire more people. Yes, correct. That's what I would write. My explanation here would be that due to lower interest rates, businesses can borrow and spend more, which should increase their ability to hire more workers, thereby increasing the employment level in Japan. You could also write decreasing the unemployment rate. That still kind of is referencing the employment level, so you're covered there. So A is technically a loanable funds market into an aggregate demand supply question. Doesn't ask you to draw the aggregate demand supply graph, but it is effectively referencing the aggregate demand supply graph. B is basically an entirely separate FRQ that has nothing to do with A, but is our Forex market stuff. So suppose that in a different part of the world, real interest rate in Canada increases relative to that in Mexico. So Canada has a higher interest rate than Mexico. Forex market for the Canadian dollar, okay. Supply and demand of Canadian dollar. Quantity of Canadian dollars. And my y-axis, it even tells me the value of the dollar is expressed as Mexican pesos per Canadian dollar. So I could get away with just writing pesos per dollar. They would be chill about that. You could also write Mexican pesos per Canadian dollars if you really wanted to. Those aren't that long of words. Stop complaining about how they're like, oh, they make you write so much. It's like you don't write a DBQ, you can stop complaining. Okay. Supply of Canadian dollars. I did C dollar sign for that, just to be like simple about it. I did write the full quantity of Canadian dollars because I'm not going to be abbreviating my axes just to be safe. And then I wrote up here pesos per dollar. That does cover it. That gives me enough. Mexican pesos per Canadian dollar is better, but writing pesos per dollar does give it away that you know what you're writing there. So there's a higher real interest rate in Canada. Okay. What'll happen internationally? Remember, this is the weird thing. When it comes to internationally, interest rates being high are good for getting money. Because if the interest rates in Canada are higher relative to Mexico, the people of Mexico would rather invest in Canada because they can make more money buying Canadian bonds, buying Canadian stock, putting their money in Canadian savings accounts, and probably committing tax fraud. They'd want to invest more in Canada. So there would be an increase in the demand for Canadian dollars. So they want to invest in Canada, so there's a greater overall demand for Canadian dollars. They want to invest more there. It's a higher demand curve. Increase the demand. Now, didn't ask you to draw the peso graph. If they had asked you to draw the peso graph instead, you would have drawn an increased supply of pesos because they would want to invest more in Canada, so they'd be supplying more of their currency internationally. So if they asked you to draw the peso graph, you would draw it as an increase in supply. There is technically another way you could have drawn it if you wanted to. You could have drawn your Canadian dollar graph as a decrease in the supply of Canadian dollars. Technically, that is allowed because you could interpret this as Canadians would be less likely to invest in Mexico because Mexico has a lower real interest rate than Canada. And if they don't want to invest in Mexico as much, they wouldn't be supplying as much of their currency internationally. So a lot of the time, not every time, but a lot of the time with a Forex market question, there's more than one way to answer it based on perspective. If I take it from the Mexican perspective, I know that they'd want to invest more in Canada. If I take it from the Canadian perspective, I know they wouldn't want to invest as much in Mexico. Pick one, go with whatever. You'd be fine for either. And then the last thing here, B2, how will the change in the value of the dollar you identified in part BI, which to be clear, the Canadian dollar appreciated. I can tell that because the price is higher, if you're wondering where I'm getting that from. This higher Y value is telling me that it's a higher price. It takes more pesos to get a dollar now. So what'll happen to Canadian exports to Mexico? Exports will fall. Again, don't just draw arrows when you're writing out answers for explanations. Write the word increase or decrease or fall or rise. I'm just doing it because I'm writing with a mouse. So the Canadian dollar, we should see a decrease in exports from Canada because the Canadian dollar has appreciated in value, which will mean, and this is what I'm writing for my explanation, which will mean that Canadian goods will get progressively more expensive for Mexicans as those pesos per dollar goes up, because it will now take more pesos to acquire a Canadian dollar, making Canada's goods more expensive for people from Mexico. That's the logic of it. That's what's going on, is that whenever that Canadian dollar value goes up, everything that's priced in Canadian dollars is now harder to get if you're using pesos, which if you're using pesos, you're from Mexico or you're living in Mexico. So there we go. I believe, if I have not messed it up, that is all 6 of the graphs. I will fix the submission on my Moodle, because the PowerPoint on my Moodle I had saved and uploaded before fixing the Forex market being hidden in this PowerPoint, because I had forgotten that I hid it, because last year we didn't have it on the AP exam because of the pandemic. We are not done with the live stream. To be clear, I am now, after you give me a 15-minute break because I need to drink and use the restroom and like breathe for like 10 minutes. After a 15-minute break, I am going to go through absolute comparative advantage, bank balance sheets, some unit 2 math, basically the other FRQs I would bet you see, like the other types of FRQs that are very likely to see. And then I'll finish up with the models and small graphs that you don't have to draw, but you do have to know. That's stuff like the business cycle, the circular flow model, the aggregate production function, those little visual bits. I'll go through those as well. That'll be the remaining part of this video. So give me 15 minutes to like use the restroom and drink tea and water, to be clear, and like breathe a little bit. Take a 15-minute break for yourself. Take a snack break real quick. I'll be back at what is 12:25 on my clock. 12:25 on my clock. I'm keeping the stream up. I'm just going to mute myself and turn off my camera, but I am still here. So if you post questions in the comments or in the chat, I will still see them for the next however long. Okay. Testing. All right. Starting back up in a couple of minutes here. So yeah, we're going to hit in sequential order absolute comparative advantage terms of trade, Unit 2's math stuff, so like GDP, CPI, unemployment rate, a little bit there, those things. And then bank balance sheet problems. We'll go through those here in a second. And then the remaining like models, visuals, they're technically graphs, but not ones you have to draw at the end. We're probably almost done. We probably only have a little bit more than an hour left, I would bet, of content here. So I don't think I'll take the full 4 hours unless you want to ask me a bunch of questions. But we'll be finishing up here shortly. Not shortly, like an hour. It's not shortly. Archer cam real quick. Archer, show him camera. Oh, you're going this way. That's not helpful. Okay, buddy. Brr. There he is. Trying to not show my legs because I'm wearing shorts. Boom, there it is. Hey, your body. Oh boy. All right. 25. Here we go. All right. Welcome back to part 2 of the Graphocalypse, the part where there aren't that many graphs left, and we still have to cover the other things that can be FRQs, just in case they decide to do them instead. All right. Oh, before I do this, here's a good thing, this little like segue between it. In terms of what to expect from this year's FRQ section for the in-person exams, this is where it's kind of tricky for us, because as teachers, I am pretty sure that they're going to have the FRQ section for in-person kids be similar to how our normal FRQs look, which is 3 FRQs is how it's definitely set up. It's definitely 3 questions, 60 minutes, like all that stuff. But in terms of the questions themselves, I would still wager that your long FRQ is mostly graph stuff. You'll have one short FRQ that's probably more math skill-based, whether that be absolute comparative advantage, Unit 2's math, bank balance sheet, something like that. And then the third FRQ that's kind of a wild card. That could be anything. Could be math, could be graphs. Probably more graphs than math, but could be whatever is the setup. I can't guarantee that. Last year's AP exam that was remote, they told us that they weren't going to make anybody graph anything on those test questions, but then some of those questions were pretty much just graph questions that instead of asking you to draw, asked you to write your graph stuff instead, like what will happen on the aggregate demand supply graph, or how will your current equilibrium compare with the long run aggregate supply? Like they made them word problems instead of draw this problems. I would assume they'll have you draw it this year. They haven't told us that they won't make you draw the graphs this year, but if they asked you something like, hey, what will happen to your Phillips curve, not draw what's happened to the Phillips curve, be aware that that's a possibility. I'm not scared about it, I'm just like curious what they're gonna do. We're not 1,000% sure, because College Board doesn't tell us everything, which is super helpful, and everybody loves it. Okay, now, out of the graphs, into the woods, let's do this. Absolute comparative advantage terms of trade, easy peasy lemon squeezy. The first 2 things here we should have really down pat, but let's clarify all of it just in case you forgot. Absolute advantage is if you can produce more than somebody else in the same amount of time, given the same amount of resources. That's it. Comparative is who can produce it at a lower opportunity cost, given the same amount of time still. So it's a matter of who can produce more versus who can produce it at a lower opportunity cost. When you're dealing with these problems, they will either be an output or an input problem. The differences are important in terms of finding who has the absolute and the comparative advantage. An output problem is a problem where the numbers presented to you are the numbers of things being made. Number of apples and oranges a group can produce. Number of white and green expo markers that could be made. Number of thing made. Number of thing made. Number of thing being put out. Output. When it's an output problem, you use other goes over, OGO, to find the opportunity cost for comparative advantage. For an input problem, where the numbers in the table are the amount of resources used to make a thing, amount of minutes to make a pizza, amount of workers to create a house, number of blank to make a thing, input, you do other goes under to find the opportunity cost. So how you find your opportunity cost gets different if it's input or output, and your absolute advantage will flip around when you're doing input problems. It still is who can make the most given the same amount of resources. Because input tells you the resource as a variable, you have to think about it a little bit differently. So if it said like it takes this person 5 minutes to make a cake and this person 3 minutes to make a cake, who can make the most cakes is the person who makes them in 3 minutes, right? If I gave them both an even playing field, the person who takes less time to make it could make more. So when it's an input problem, you have to be a little bit careful about like, oh wait, the low number is good for absolute advantage and stuff like that. So this is an example from my PowerPoint that I use over absolute comparative advantage where I have like 55 examples. So first things first, I've got Zaire and Colombia, the amount of canned olives and olive oil they can produce from 1 ton of olives. So both countries have a ton of olives. This is what they can make from that. The numbers in the table here are the amount of a thing being produced. Amount of canned olives, amount of olive oil being made. That means it's an output problem. Who's the absolute advantage in this? In both of them, it's Zaire, because they can make more canned olives than Colombia. They can make more olive oil than Colombia. So Zaire has the absolute advantage in canned. They have the absolute advantage in olive oil. That does not require really anything to think about. For comparative advantage, you have to find the opportunity costs, and that's where it gets tricky. You have to do some work. You have to figure out for everything of canned olives Zaire makes, how much olive oil did they give up? I'm doing this little symbol with the O so I know it's not a 0. For Colombia, how many things of canned olives do they make? How much olive oil are they giving up per unit of canned olives? So for this, it's an output problem. I mentioned that, which means I'm going to do other goes over output O's. That's really easy to remember. Output problem. So I will take the other columns number, 10. It goes over my current columns number, 60. 10 over 60 is a 6th. Every time they make one thing of canned olives, they could have made a 6th of a thing of olive oil. For this one, other goes over. 8 over 24 is a 3rd. Apologies for whatever's going on outside my apartment. And then for these, same thing. Got to do it this way also. Got to figure out for every olive oil and for every olive oil how many canned olives they're giving up. I still do other goes over. Take the other column's number 60. It goes over this column's number 10. 60 over 10 is 6. 24 over 8 is 3. Things that are shortcuts, these are reciprocals of each other, so that saves you time. That's a nice little shortcut. Comparative advantage in canned olives. So I go to the canned olive column and I look at my opportunity costs. Comparative advantage is who has the lower opportunity cost. That would be Zaire. So Zaire has the comparative advantage in canned olives. However, Colombia would have the comparative advantage in olive oil because it only takes them 3 canned olives per thing of olive oil. For all of my students who I've seen do these and struggle a lot, one of the easiest ways they struggle is they don't write it like this. They don't write anything sometimes and just try to do it all in their head, which is a mistake. They don't write it like this. They just write like 1/6 or 6 or 1/3 or 3. And what they mess up is they're like, wait, is it a 6th of canned olives or is it a 6th of olive oil? I don't know. That's where you get messed up when it comes to like, wait a minute, is the opportunity cost canned olives or olive oil? Well, my brain, write it like this every time. It's the canned olives, so it's 1 canned olive. Olive oil, so it's 1 olive oil. For some amount of the other thing. I write it like this for a reason. I'm not doing it because I think it's funny or because I want to waste time. I do not like wasting time. I want to make sure you pass. So there's my opportunity costs. What if this table instead represented the amount of labor hours to make 1 ton of canned olives or 1 ton of olive oil? So if instead of these representing the amount of things they can make, if this is the amount of hours it took to make, it takes Zaire 60 hours to make a thing of canned olives. It takes Colombia 24 hours to make a thing of canned olives. That would mean Colombia can make more. So that's the absolute advantage for Colombia. That's where it becomes an input problem and things get different. Now, for an input problem, your definitions don't change. For an input problem, the absolute advantage is still who can produce the most, if I give them both the same amount of time. It's just, if this is the amount of hours it takes for them to make it, Colombia could make more of them. If I gave them both the same amount of time, Colombia is pumping out a lot more than Zaire is, because it takes them 60 hours to make a ton of them. It takes Colombia only 24 hours. Colombia is better in that example. For input comparative advantage, I just do other goes under. For everything of canned olives, they could have made 3 things of olive oil, because if it took them 24 hours to make a thing of canned olives and 8 hours to make a thing of olive oil, then whenever they produced 1 thing of canned olives, they could have made 3 things of olive oil, because it took them 24 hours to make that and 8 hours to make that. So I use other goes under to find the opportunity cost there. It's still lower opportunity cost for comparative advantage. It's just how I find the opportunity cost that changes. Okay, the final step of these problems is if they make it a term of trade problem, which is when they tack on to the end of all of that what would be a potentially good trade for both countries in those examples. A term of trade is just a possible trade between both parties. For it to be beneficial to a party, it just has to get them more of whatever than what they got before. Whatever they got before is their opportunity cost. These opportunity costs are basically trade deals within their borders. Basically, for Zaire, if one was an olive problem, every time they gave up 1 thing of olive oil, they would have gotten back 6 things of canned olives. So that's basically a trade of 1 for 6. They just need to be getting in a trade more than that. For it to be mutually beneficial, they must fall between their opportunity costs. This is the key thing. To find a mutually beneficial term of trade, it must just be a trade that falls between their opportunity costs. So the steps to solve a full term of trade problem with explanation, all of that is the first thing you've got to know is who specializes in one. It'll help you explain it. It'll help you get the logic and the reasoning down if you know who is making what. That's based on comparative advantage. So if you've got a comparative advantage, you'll specialize in that. I then set up the opportunity costs as a range and make sure you use your opportunity costs where it's like 1 of blank equals X of blank. Like how I've done my opportunity costs, the 1 for 1/6, the 1 for 1/3, that set up like that. And then compare the term of trade to the opportunity costs, keeping in mind which party is trading which good. One side will be gaining more than less. The other side will be giving up more or less for it to be beneficial. So here is the FRQ. Here is the FRQ that they've done with this. They've done a bunch of them, but this is just the simplest one, I think. We've got 2 countries, Atlantis and Xanadu. They have equal amounts of resources. Atlantis can produce 30 cars or 10 tractors. Xanadu can produce 20 cars or 40 tractors. I'm going to use my whiteboard for this just because I don't like doing all of this math stuff on the thing. So I'm going to make my camera a little bit bigger so you guys can see my whiteboard a little bit better. I'm going to turn this into a table. This information, I'm going to translate it into a table for myself to help me out. I've got Atlantis and Xanadu. They make cars and they make tractors. Atlantis can make 30 cars or 10 tractors. Xanadu can make 20 cars or 40 tractors. So I've done this. Xanadu, Atlantis, cars, tractors. 30, 10, 20, 40. A, who's got the absolute advantage in tractors? Explain how you figured that out. Show your work. Do your math. Well, this is easy. Absolute advantage is who can make the most. 40 is bigger than 10. Xanadu. My answer is Xanadu because, and here's why your explanation matters, because they can produce more given the same amount of resources. Absolute advantage is who can produce the most given the same amount of resources. It tells me they have the same amount of resources. Xanadu can produce more. Done. Easy, easy. Layup question, layup question. But you got to explain it. The explanation isn't just that 40 is bigger than 10. It's because they can produce more given the same amount of resources. B, who's got a comparative advantage in cars using the concept of opportunity cost? Explain how you determined your answer. Okay, I'm going to finish up my table here. So Atlantis can make 30 cars or 10 tractors. So the opportunity cost of them making a car is other goes over. That's 10 over 30. So 1/3 of a tractor. The opportunity cost of Xanadu making a car is 40 over 20 or 2 tractors. So I've got Atlantis makes every time Atlantis makes a car, they gave up a third of a tractor. Every time Xanadu makes a car, they gave up 2 tractors. That would mean that Atlantis has the comparative advantage in cars. Using the concept of opportunity cost to explain how you determine your answer, I would say because the opportunity cost of Atlantis producing a car is 1/3 of a tractor, while the opportunity cost of Xanadu producing a car is 2 tractors, Atlantis has the comparative advantage because they have the lower opportunity cost. You could have just said because Atlantis has a lower opportunity cost if you had your math somewhere. Like me doing this table, I would have probably put this in my answer. I would have probably just drawn this table before I did anything here and then just referenced it in B, where it's like Atlantis has the comparative advantage in cars because they have a lower opportunity cost. C table. That's what I would do. C. If the 2 countries specialize in trade, who will be importing cars and explain? If they specialize in trade, means one's making one, the other's making the other. You make whatever you have a comparative advantage in. So I'm just writing the opportunity costs of 1 tractor for both because I'm going to probably need it. Who cares? If they specialize in trade, who will be importing cars is a very fancy way of asking who's making tractors. Because if you are making the tractors and specializing in trading, you would be trading for, therefore importing the cars. It's like, who's trading for the cars? Oh, the guys who make tractors. Who's making tractors? Xanadu. Why is Xanadu the one importing cars? Well, that's because Xanadu has a comparative advantage in tractors. So they should specialize in tractors and then trade tractors for cars, comma, thereby importing cars from Atlantis. That's how I phrase that. And then D, term of trade. It tells me the term of trade is 1 car for 1 tractor. One car for 1 tractor. So when I'm doing my steps, I need to know who's making what, which I do. Did that already. Atlantis is making cars. I'm going to be using blue for Atlantis. So that's 1 car from Atlantis. I'll use yellow for Xanadu. Xanadu's trading tractors. So it's 1 car from Atlantis for 1 tractor from Xanadu. I know that because of specialization. It says they're doing terms of trade, so they're specializing. For Atlantis, the opportunity cost of producing 1 car was 1/3 of a tractor. For Xanadu, I don't think the yellow will be very easy to read, so I'm just going to use the black. The opportunity cost of producing a car is 2 tractors. So the blue is Atlantis, the black is Xanadu. Apologies for the yellow on that, but whatever, we'll figure it out. Okay, so I have my opportunity costs, I have the range. Now I need to compare to the opportunity cost and see who's benefiting and why. Question technically only asks me how Atlantis is benefiting, so I only have to care about that, but I'm going to explain both for me. Atlantis used to give up 1 car and get back 1/3 of a tractor when they were making things on their own. Now they're giving up 1 car to Xanadu and getting 1 whole tractor, meaning Atlantis is gaining 2/3 of a tractor compared to before. Oh, Will, I didn't see your question for a while. So does the fraction describe how many of the other good it takes to make 1 of the other? I mean, there's a lot of pronouns there, Will. The fraction or whatever, the opportunity cost tells me how much of the other good it costs to make that good. So like for 1C for 1/3 T here, it's telling me that for every car I make, it costs me 1/3 of a tractor. That helps. The danger you guys get into is saying a lot of other and pronoun and other and this one and that one. It's like use the proper nouns. It'll help you a little better. For Xanadu, and so to be clear here, how does this benefit Atlantis? It benefits Atlantis because Atlantis will be gaining 2/3 more of a tractor than they would have on their own, because on their own, whenever they gave up 1 car, they got back 1/3 of a tractor, and now by trading 1 car to Xanadu, they are getting 1 whole tractor. It's a better deal. That's the answer for this question. But to explain it for Xanadu, Xanadu is also benefiting here. People mess this up. They're like, Xanadu's getting less than before. Say, 2 is bigger than 1. This hurts them. It's like, guys, I swear to God, Xanadu's the one trading away the tractors. They're getting cars. They used to give up 2 tractors for 1 car. Now they're giving up 1 tractor for 1 car. Not only is Xanadu benefiting, they're benefiting by more than Atlantis is. Because they are actually getting an entire additional tractor. It's saving them money. It is now cheaper for them. Because here's the deal for terms of trade that people do struggle with. When you're finding a proper term of trade, one side will be gaining more than before. In this case, is Atlantis. They're gaining 2/3 more. One side will be giving up less than before. That is also good. Giving up less is great. Giving up less is cheaper. You want to be giving up less. So these guys are gaining 1 tractor because they're giving up 1 less tractor. They get to keep 1 tractor extra. So it's good for both because it's right between the 2. Stop trying to not write your opportunity costs like this. Stop it. Stop doing that. Just stop. Stop it. Stop trying to be lazy on this. You wanting to be lazy on this is what's making it harder for you. I don't believe in wasting time, but this is probably the hardest thing in Unit 1. I'm not gonna I'm not gonna do anything that's gonna hurt my grade. I'm gonna do everything I can to get a 5. If you want to rush through this and get a 3 instead and hope your college takes credit, go for it. I'm gonna take my time and get a 5. That's what I would do. Okay. So for term of trade, you're trying to find the one between their opportunity costs. That's about it. It gave you the term of trade here, which is great. It could have asked you to find a term of trade that's mutually beneficial. I could have picked any number in between 1/3 and 2. 1 is fine. 1.5 would have been fine. 0.75 would have been fine. It wouldn't have mattered. As long as it was between 1/3 and 2, it would have worked just fine. Okay. Term of trade done. Bank balance sheet. Now, luckily, a lot of you guys in class yesterday actually asked me to do a bank balance sheet problem because you realized you forgot it, and I had mentioned it as like a thing that could be an FRQ, so you're like, what the hell is this thing again? It's a good thing to ask about because I think this might be your FRQ. The math FRQ, I think, might be this for you guys. So, a bank balance sheet's a T-chart that compares a bank's assets and liabilities. Sorry, my head is too big for this. There it is. Assets include things like their required reserves, their excess reserves, loans, any bonds they might have bought. Hell, any furniture the bank bought. Anything that the bank can sell for money is an asset. Liabilities are things they're responsible for. So if they have deposits, they are responsible for your deposits. If they take a loan from another bank, they are liable to pay that back. And owner's equity, which is money that the bank would owe to its owner for investing into it. There are 2 rules to follow. First rule, you have to maintain the reserve requirement, meaning your required reserves must be whatever percentage they're supposed to be of the deposit. So if your reserve requirement is 25%, then your required reserves have to always end up at 25% of your demand deposits, unless they change the reserve requirement. And the second one, both sides must equal one another. Assets must equal liabilities. So here's a short version question. Got a nice simple balance sheet here. This is very basic stuff. 250, 500, 250, 1,000. What is the reserve requirement? I'm looking at this. It's the percentage of the deposit. So this is X percentage of this. 250 is 25% of 1,000. I don't have to do much from there. How much can be loaned out initially? This is a trick question a lot of the time, because kids want to involve this, and you're wrong to. That 250 is not loanable money, it's money that has been loaned out. There's currently $250 this bank has given away to other people. This bank right now can loan out $500. Because that's what the excess reserves are. The excess reserves are the amount of loanable money the bank has. It's all of the money the bank can actually loan out. So it's 500 there. And this is the part where it gets kind of complicated for kids. They don't always ask you to do this, so don't feel like you have to worry about this every time, but they can. What happens to the required and excess reserves if someone withdraws $500 from this bank? So if I'm fixing the balance sheet, basically, I'm taking 500 out of the deposits. And I've got to take 500 out of this left side too. The obvious place to take it out is the excess reserves. Because again, that's the usable money for the bank. That's the money that's like first to go for the bank. But this rule is currently not being followed. My required reserves must be, in this case, 25% of my deposits. 250 isn't 25% of 500. It's half of it. So I've got to fix this. This needs to be 125. That is 25% of 500. And then my excess reserves would also change to 125. The reason being is that 250 that was in the required reserves got split up. Half of it stayed to stay as required reserves so that it's maintaining the reserve requirement. The rest of it is now left over and can be used by the bank. Well, let's check our rules. My assets, my required reserves are 25% of my deposit. 125 is 25% of 500. Check. Both sides equal one another. 125, 125, 250. That's 500, 500. Good. So my required reserves would go to 125. My excess reserves would go to 125. My loans would stay at 250 because I can't really call that money back. It's just kind of gone now. Kind of been loaned out. But that's not an FRQ. That's just an example. Here's an FRQ. Here's an FRQ, and it's what I would consider one of the harder bank balance sheet FRQs I've ever seen. I can do most of this on this. I don't need my whiteboard for a lot of it. So we got this bank balance sheet of First Superior Bank. They've only got $200 in reserves and $1,800 in loans and $2,000 in demand deposits and $0 of equity. Okay, so I can ignore the equity because there's zero, so I don't have to even worry about that. All right. Here's the important thing to tell off of this balance sheet. That's weird. And that's weird. Is that the reserves here, they have not specified whether those are required reserves or excess reserves. They're not telling me. I don't know. I gotta figure it out. I can figure it out though because of the first thing the question tells me. Assume the reserve requirement is 10%. If the reserve requirement is 10% and there's $2,000 in demand deposits, then I actually automatically know that this isn't reserves. This is the required reserves. Because the bank has to have 10% of the demand deposits in their required reserves. 10% of 2,000 is 200. That's all required, meaning this bank has no excess reserves right now. Like if this was 1,750 and this was 250, I would know that even though it's listed as 250 here, that 200 of it is required because of this, and 50 of it is excess. When they just say reserves here, you can't assume it's required reserves. When you say reserves, you mean total reserves. You mean both of them combined. It's just that 200 plus 0 is 0, so it's fine. The reason why that matters is the very first question it asks. What is the dollar value of new loans that this bank can make? How much money can this bank loan out right now? 0. This bank cannot loan out for heckin' anything. This bank can't loan out anything. Why? They've already loaned out every piece of the pie they could. $1,800 has been loaned out. It is gone. How much can they loan out now? Literally none. Those aren't new loans. Those are old loans. New loans, 0. As they've got 200 in their required reserves. They've got nothing in the excess. They can't loan out anything. So the explanation would be, this bank cannot make any new loans because this bank has already loaned out all of its excess reserves. It currently has 0 excess reserves, so it cannot loan on anything. 2. Mr. Smith deposits $100 of cash in a demand deposit account in First Superior Bank. Calculate the maximum amount of new loans that this bank can now make. So how much in new loans can this bank now make? Well, out of this $100 deposit, remember they couldn't loan out anything, so it's going to be something plus 0. Out of this $100, the bank will have to hold on to 10% of it. So $10 goes to the required, and then $90 goes to the excess. You okay, Arch? Yeah, he's fine. Coughing up a loogie. Okay. So it's $90 in terms of new loans this bank can now make. Because if they were to loan out every dollar they could off of that deposit, it would be $90. Okay. As a result of Mr. Smith's $100 deposit, calculate the maximum change over time in each of the following in the banking system: loans, demand deposits. Change over time, multiplier. If you see the words change over time, that is a cue for it's time to bust out the multiplier effect. Let's multiply some stuff. The amount of loans they can make over time is the same as the amount they can change the money supply by, because what they're doing is they are loaning out money multiple times thereover. The formula I'm going to use here is the change in the excess reserves multiplied by the money multiplier equals the change in, technically it's the change in the money supply, but it will also work as the change in loans. The excess reserves were 90. The money multiplier is 1 over the reserve requirement, so 1 over 0.1. To be clear, 1 over 0.1 is 10, because it's 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, 10. 0.1 goes into 1 10 times. So 90 times 10 is $900. It's the answer to 1. The bank can loan out $900 over time by loaning out loans of loans of loans through the lending process through what's called the money multiplier effect. Now, the second one, I don't give students a formula for this because they don't really use this very often, but it is technically a thing where if over time this bank was able to loan out $900, how much money had to have been deposited there over time? Remember, this bank can loan out 90% of its deposits. So 900 is 90% of 1,000. So the answer to 2 is 1,000, but I can show you a formula for it if you want it. I use this exact same logic. I take the change in deposits times the multiplier. So the deposits were 100 times 1 over 0.1. And it's 1,000. Not a thing you see very often. I think they've only asked about this kind of thing this one time. It's the only time I've ever seen it. I was like, what the hell do they do this for? Just to scare kids? But the logic is important for you to understand that if the way the multiplier works is that money gets deposited, lent out, deposited, lent out, deposited, lent out, then it's not just the loans that are changing, it's the deposits that get changed too, because it's not like they can't loan out money that's not deposited there, right? So if they were able to loan out $900, that means that the bank at some point had to have had $1,000 deposited there, because this bank can loan out 90% of their deposits, and 900 is 90% of 1,000. 4. As a result of the cash deposit, calculate the maximum change over time in the money supply. Well, I already did that. That's what this formula is. This and this are the same. The money supply and the amount of loans that are changing over time are the same thing logically, because how they're creating money is through lending. Loans are how money is being created. So they actually created $900 over time. It says the banks can make more money exist in our economy than actually exists deal of fractional reserve banking. That when you deposit money into the bank, a portion of it gets loaned out. That person can then deposit it back into the bank, and the bank can loan that out too. And it gets really scary. And then 5, provide one reason why the actual change in the money supply would be smaller than what you found in Part D. Like, why wouldn't it be 900? There's a bunch of reasons why this would be the case. Cash is a possible reason where, like, if I don't put my money in the bank, they can't lend it out. So if whenever we're doing this multiplier process, if I don't deposit all of it into the bank, if I hold on to any of it in the form of cash, then this multiplier effect won't be as big, because the conceit of it is money gets deposited in the bank and lent out, deposited, lent out. No one is forcing me to deposit it there. So if I didn't deposit it, if I held it in cash, multiplier is not really happening. The bank is not required to loan out every dollar they can. There's no rule saying they have to. They like to because it makes them the most money. They're not required to. So the other reason would be that the bank doesn't lend out all of their excess reserves. That would be another answer. This question's worth looking at because of the answers here. Look at this. 0 explanation. 90, 900, 1,900. When my kids look at this, they oftentimes will get stuck with like, wait a minute, which of these is 90, which one of them is 900? New loans now make not a multiplier. Overtime, multiplier. Oh, Daniel, just making sure this type of question, you also have to write a complete sentence. You always have to write a complete sentence. Unless it is quite literally a math problem. So like where it says calculate, you can write just the math answer if you want. You can just write the number, but you have to show your work for it. So like for these ones, it's easy to show the work. Like I would just write basically all of this and then box this or this, and you'd be good. For 3. For 5, I have to write, I can't just write the word cash. Like I'd have to write people will hold on to their money in the form of cash so banks can't lend it, which would decrease the multiplier stuff. Like I have to write it out. Yeah. I'm just not, because again, mouse. I'm not writing full sentences here because of the mouse. You do need to be writing in space, complete sentences for every answer that has you write text. Don't write a complete sentence when they ask you to graph it. You don't have to write a complete sentence when they ask you to calculate it. But if they're asking you a question, write in a complete sentence, yes. Okay. The other FRQ pattern that I've seen quite a bit is Unit 2 Math. I don't like that. That's weird. It's some weird typo stuff there. If it says things twice, it's only supposed to say it once. So the other FRQ type I have seen frequently, saw it a ton last year. Almost swore. A ton last year's FRQ. Apologies, that was close. A ton last year was a bunch of Unit 2 math stuff. Because last year's AP exam didn't have any graphs on it. It was a bunch of math problems because they could ask you the math and you could answer math questions without drawing anything. So they asked a bunch of math questions, and as you guys should know, most of the math for the class is in Unit 2. Most of it's in Unit 2. It's GDP stuff, it's CPI stuff, it's unemployment rate stuff, all of those. GDP deflator, price times quantity, all of that stuff. Bunch of stuff. So here is one of those types of questions, and it's one that was very tricky for students, so I want to run you through it because it's one of those ones where your formulas might not help you as much as you like. I did assign this out to kids before, so you should have seen this before, but it's been a long time for you first semester kids when we've seen this. So we've got the data for the economy of Fruitland, which produces apples and oranges. We've got year 1, they sold apples for $4, they sold 15 apples, sold oranges for $10, sold 4 oranges. Year 2 sold 6, also sold 10 at 6, sold 20 at 5. Okay. Calculate the nominal GDP for year 2. If you're looking at your formula sheets and stuff like that, the formulas for nominal GDP are like real over deflator or C plus I plus G plus XN. That's not here. What do I do? Okay, so what you do, this is not complicated. Nominal GDP is just the total dollar value of everything produced in your economy in a year. This economy only produces apples and oranges. How much value did they produce that year? That's all I'm asking. Year 2. You take price times quantity. Price times quantity. Add them. That's it. So I would do 6 times 10. $6 per apple for 10 apples. And 5 times 20. Six times 10 is 60. 5 times 20 is 100. So this would be. This is the total dollar value of everything produced in this economy in year 2. That's it. That's all nominal GDP is. It's the total dollar value of everything produced in your economy in that year. They produced 10 apples and 20 oranges. What's the total dollar value of all of that stuff? Those are the prices. Multiply and add. All you're doing. B, using year 1 as the base year, calculate real GDP for year 2. Okay, but they don't give me the deflator, Mr. McRitchie. How can I possibly do that? Remember, what is real GDP? Real GDP is GDP adjusted for inflation. It tells me, using year 1 as the base year. That has to matter. Why does that matter? Oh, because the way real GDP corrects for inflation is by holding prices constant. What do you mean holding prices constant? I mean they use the base year's prices. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the base year's prices, that and that. 4 times 10 and 10 times 20. Why? Why did you do that, Mr. McRitchie? Because I'm using year 2's production, the quantities, and my base year's prices to measure, okay, how much more in value did they produce going from year 1 to year 2? Using year 1 as the value that I'm framing it around, they actually produced $240 worth of value. So they produced a heck of a lot more. Oh, it's okay. Yeah, it started at 10, but it saves on my YouTube, so you're fine. Yeah, you'll see it. It'll save after, so you can go back and look at the rest of it. You're fine. Don't worry about it. It started at 10. I've only said it for like a week. It's cool. You're fine. You forget stuff. It's okay. Okay, 162.40. Those are my 2 answers. Okay, now I can do the GDP deflator. The GDP deflator equals nominal over real times 100. Nominal, 160. Real, 240. Which are like, okay, so to be clear, 16 over 24 simplifies down, because I can divide both those numbers by 8. 2/3. 2/3 times 100, 67. Or 66.6 repeating. You could have done that too. 66.6, 66.7. They wouldn't have cared. I just write 67, but that's fine. For those of you that know what the GDP deflator is, it being 67 is weird because it's less than 100. It means that there was deflation between those 2 years, that prices on average went down by like 33%, which you're like, how does that happen, McRitchie? I mean, look at the table. Yes, apples went up to $6, but oranges price dropped in half, from 10 down to 5. That's a huge drop. So apples went up by a little bit. Oranges went down by a ton. So there is actually deflation here. If your GDP deflator is less than 100, you actually have deflation. Prices went down, which would explain why this real GDP is so much higher than this. Okay, D. This is the part kids got really messed up by. D is where kids got completely knocked off their socks. They're like, how do I find CPI without a market basket, Mr. McRitchie? I don't get it. Because the CPI formula is the price of a market basket in the current year over the price of the market basket in the base year. And they got really messed up by that. So it says the market basket is composed of the quantities in year 1. Calculate the CPI for year 2. So the CPI of year 2 would equal price of the market basket in the current year over the price of the market basket in the base year times 100. Now everything like, what's the market basket, Rich? I don't know what the market basket is. It tells you. The market basket is the quantities of the good in year 1, meaning the market basket is 15 apples and 4 oranges. You have to take that literally. You take it literally. It's all you have to go off of is what it tells you. So it's the market basket is 15 apples and 4 oranges. How much did it cost to get 15 apples and 4 oranges in the current year, year 2, and the base year, year 1? Well, in year 2, 6 times 15, 5 times 4, 6 times 15 is 90. Yeah. 5 times 4 is 20. So it would be 110, which you're like, uh-oh, this can't be good. And then in year 1, four times 15 is 60. 10 times 4 is 40. Oh, bang. The CPI is 110. The CPI would have been 110 because the price of the market basket in year 2 was 110. I did 6 times 15 plus 5 times 4 for that to find the price of the market basket, total price of the market basket. And the price of the market basket in the base year, 4 times 15, 10 times 4, it's 100. So it's canceled out. 110. That's it. It looks scary because you're not used to practicing like that or seeing that. It's the only time I've ever done this on an AP exam question too, which is great when they just throw a curveball in and like, we've never done this before. Ha 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 ha. Hope they don't fail. And then they make you lose college credit. It's great. Sick prank. Gotta love it. Fix College Board. But it's doable. Like, you just gotta read it. Market basket is the quantities in year 1, okay? Literally. The market basket is 15 apples, 4 oranges. What's the price of that in each year? 15 apples and 4 oranges cost 110 in year 2. 15 apples and 4 oranges cost 100 in year 1. Times 100. Oh, got it. Okay. E. Suppose apple and orange pickers received a 2% increase in their wages. Okay. Based on your answer to part D, hello, would the real wages of apple and orange pickers increase, decrease, or stay the same from year 1 to year 2, and explain? Okay. So they're asking, based off the price change, what's going on? Well, technically a formula here, if you want it, you might not need it. Some of you guys have the CPI inflation thing down. But inflation rate, which I'm abbreviating here, I apologize, equals the CPI of year 2 minus the CPI of year 1 over the CPI of year 1 times 100. That looks terrifying, but, and it's always important to mention this, your base year CPI, which we're comparing to just 2 years here, so it is the base year. Your base year CPI is always 100. And the CPI for year 2 is 110. 110 minus 100 over 100 is 10% inflation. That's not the answer. I need to understand that to find the answer. They are getting paid 2% more. There's 10% inflation. Their real wages are decreasing by 8%. Because they're getting paid 2% more. Everything in this economy, which is literally just apples and oranges, but whatever, is now on average 10% more expensive. Oh no. Right, that's bad. They're getting paid 2% more, but everything's 10% more expensive, so they're really poorer. Explanation would be, because there is 10% inflation due to the CPI of year 2, the workers only receiving a 2% increase in their wages will actually lead to a decrease in their real wages of 8%. You don't need to have the math there. You just have to say a decrease in their real wages, because while the workers are getting paid more, the average prices are going up by significantly more than that. So the value of those wages is lower now. Basically, they have less spending power. They're functionally poorer. They're getting paid more, but they can't buy as much stuff because while they're getting paid 2% more, they're actually losing 10%. If you just said that it was 10% inflation, would you lose points for not showing the work? No, because it's not. It doesn't ask you to do that math. For E, it doesn't ask you to solve for the inflation rate. You just had to know that your CPI being 110 meant that it was 10% inflation. So no, if you get how CPI works, you probably don't even need to do the formula. So on E specifically, you would not have had to actually show the work for that inflation rate thing, because hopefully you do get that your CPI being 110 means that there's been 10% inflation since the base year, because your base year CPI is always 100. So if my CPI is 104, that means it's been 4%. If it's 137.5, that means there's been 37.5% inflation. If my CPI is 200, it means there's been 100% inflation. because your base year CPI is always 100. Ooh, water. Okay. Okay. Now, those are all of the, I would say, standard FRQs. There's the 3 math ones, which are absolute comparative advantage, bank balance sheet, and Unit 2 math. Now, to be clear, Unit 2 math doesn't mean you'll have to do that weird CPI thing. It's the only time I've ever asked people to do that. If you look at the video from a week ago, on Tuesday, where I did like the mock FRQs, the second FRQ I did in that video was a different Unit 2 math problem. There are Unit 2 math problems that hit on unemployment rate. There are Unit 2 math problems that hit on labor force participation rate. There are Unit 2 math problems that make you do nominal GDP with the deflator formula. Like all of those Unit 2 formulas, Unit 2 math problems can hit on any of them. That's why you got to know those, because you don't want to be sitting there like, wait, what the hell? How do I find CPI? Because you forgot the CPI formula was price of a market basket, so knowing that the market basket is this would have helped. That's why you got to know those formulas, because there's like, this could be the Unit 2 math FRQ, and I don't want to miss that because I just didn't want to memorize some formulas, because that's not too hard. Memorizing things is not that bad. You can memorize stuff. So there's the Unit 2 math, there's the bank balance sheet, and there's the absolute comparative advantage are like your other non-graph common FRQs. I say common, it doesn't mean every year they give you this. It's just like, I would say like in a 3-year pattern, one year will probably be a bank balance sheet, 1 year will probably be a comparative absolute advantage, 1 year will probably be a Unit 2 math. Last year's AP exam, again, because it was remote and they had like 85 different FRQ prompts because of how many kids they were giving the exam to and all of like cheating and all that stuff they were trying to stop. They had FRQs of all types, but the thing that they have asked the most recently out of all of these on a normal AP exam was Unit 2 math, then comparative absolute advantage terms of trade, then bank balance sheets. So if I was to guess, I would assume bank balance sheets is most likely, then comparative absolute advantage terms of trade, then Unit 2 math. But I can't guarantee you that because the AP exams this year, being in person and remote, makes things kind of hard to predict. So be on top of it for all of them. But I would wager one of your 3 FRQs will be one of these 3 things. One of your 2 short FRQs would be one of these 3 things, I would imagine. Okay, now some other things that won't be the focus of an FRQ but might be like sprinkled in, so I call these little FRQ sprinkles that are just like a part of it, like, hey, it's this on part C, they're making you do spending multiplier stuff, yikes. It won't be the entire question, it'll just be a part of it worth 1 or 2 points in a question. So be aware of these topics as well. I'm not going to pull up full FRQs in these, but if you look through FRQs we have solved, you'll see questions over this stuff thrown in there. Oh, Mona, good question. How many multiple choice and FRQs will be on this test? AP exam format for econ is 60 multiple choice questions in 70 minutes. That is right on pace with our tests in class. You will go right up to the buzzer, I would bet, most of you. Like, you might finish early, go back through and read through the questions again if you finish early. Do not close the book in 70 minutes. Don't you dare take a nap after finishing multiple choice questions. You should go back and look through them because a question might have said long run, it might have said assume that price level is constant. Like, they might say stuff that you would need to see and not mess up. Because a lot of you guys have done test corrections in my class and realized, man, if I'd only read that again, I would have gotten it right. So none of you, no matter how fast you are of a test taker, should close your test book on the multiple choice section. 70 minutes, 60 questions. That is barely more than a minute per question. Go back through, double check. Don't you dare put it away. FRQs, 3 FRQs, 60 minutes. 3 FRQs in 60 minutes. You've got 10 minutes of reading time and 50 minutes of writing time for the FRQs, but you can start answering your questions in that 10 minutes of writing time. You don't have to go by that breakdown. You can just start. You don't have to wait. So it's a total of 2 hours and 10 minutes of designated exam time, probably an extra 30 minutes of administration stuff that we have to do of getting you set up, bubbling in stuff, and a 15-minute break or 10-minute break in between the 2 sections, stuff like that. But yeah, you need to be really cognizant of time. I would say your FRQ, I mean, for both of them, you'll be kind of up to the buzzer. This won't be an exam where you finish with a bunch of time to spare. Some of you on your FRQs might finish with a good amount of time to spare. If you do, go back through, double check, did you explain it well enough? Double check, did you label everything? Did you draw arrows on your graph? Did you show your work on your math? Don't you dare skip some basic stuff and lose points for dumb reasons. Don't want that. Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. Do want to make sure you know the rules. Okay. Capital stock and economic growth, that was mentioned before, as if you have more capital stock, you'll have economic growth that is tied oftentimes to investment spending. The quantity theory of money is just a rando thing that they can throw at you to freak you out. Just go, know the formula, be aware of what it means, and you should be fine. M1, money supply, cash and money in circulation. If you withdraw money from your bank account, M1 does not change. It's like the most frequently asked trick question on FRQs is like, someone deposits or withdraws money from their bank. What happens to the money supply? Do you think it would be a good idea to write out all of the graphs and equations before the FRQ multiple choice? I don't think it would be a good use of time to write all the formulas, because there are like 20 of them. I think it would be a good idea to do quick sketches of 6 graphs. Have a production possibilities curve, Forex market, global funds market, money market, aggregate demand supply curve, all of those. That would be for the multiple choice section. On the FRQs, and if you watch my video from Tuesday where I do like an FRQ mock exam, I explain this. I use that 10-minute of reading time, which I only use about 5 minutes of it, but I use that reading time to go through the questions, circle which graphs I need to draw, and either write the graph or do a tiny baby sketch of the graph on like the orange packet where my questions are. Like I would skim through it, be like, oh, money market, circle, vertical supply curve, down sloping demand curve, got it. Nominal interest rate, cool. I see global funds market, cool, quick little sketch of that. Like I would do that on my FRQ section of, I would skim through. Ditto for formulas. If they ask for real GDP and there's a deflator, I'd write nominal over deflator equals, or nominal over deflator times 100. Like I would do that. I would use the reading time for that exactly on the FRQ. Multiple choice, I wouldn't bother writing all the formulas. It would eat up too much of your time. 60 questions in 70 minutes is tight. It's a tight amount. It's not like your government exam where a lot of you guys were only needed like half of the time. It's not going to happen on econ. Okay, sorry, more. Who benefits and is hurt by inflation? The short version is borrowers are benefit from it. Lenders and savers get hurt by it, but we've gone over this a bunch. Make sure you know labor force and unemployment, who is unemployed, who's in the labor force, what the formulas are for those, because those could be snuck in, and balance payments accounts. These are all things that won't be the focus of an FRQ. I've seen these last two be like half of an FRQ before each, where like half of the FRQ was doing unemployment rate, labor force participation rate. Half of one of the FRQs was like, is this recorded in the current or the financial account kind of deal. Like they've snuck in there as like surprise weird things, but know what those are. Like just for balance payments accounts, know that they offset and know what's recorded in each. For unemployment labor force, know the formulas, know who's unemployed and who's not. Those are like, again, little things they sprinkle in there. They're not the focus of an FRQ, but they're worth a point or two here or there in random FRQs. So these are like nice things to make sure that you're refreshed on for your FRQs. And again, this PowerPoint's on my Moodle. I'm going to make sure that I re-upload it by the end of the video because I have an error in it. All right. The models. This is fast. We can do these relatively quickly because you don't have to draw these. But the random models and other graphs you don't have to draw, but you have to know for the AP exam. There's a handful, like 3. Really only 2, but 3. So the business cycle is our economy over time. The y-axis here is real GDP. I don't know why that's cut off. I don't really care. But you got troughs, expansionary periods, peaks, recessionary periods, troughs again. The idea is very simple. Your economy has ups and downs. There's a general trend line for your economy that is full employment. So like LRA, like this line, this trend line is full employment. It's LRAS. It's like we always kind of come back to this. We're always like gravitating around that trend line. So at the peak, you've got really, really high inflation, really, really low unemployment. This would have been like end of 2019, beginning of 2020, pre-pandemic. We were at what was effectively an economic peak. We were at very, very low unemployment. We weren't at that high of inflation rate because of weird stuff happening internationally. We got lucky there, but we were at very low unemployment. A trough would be when you have very high unemployment and typically pretty low inflation. I would say, honest to God, the trough already hit for us. I would say the trough probably hit for us like months 3 through 6 of the pandemic. We haven't gone as much of like a pickup like here. It's been much more of like a gradual. We're still kind of low, but it's like looking positive in certain respects right now. We're in kind of a still in the trough section, I would say right now, but like the big part of the trough already hit. Upward sloping parts are your recovery periods where like GDP is starting to climb back up. It hasn't like gone back to where it's supposed to be, but it's getting there. Like if you're imagining a recessionary gap, the gap is getting smaller as you go up this line, and once you pass that full employment line, you're like, boom, we closed it. And then you keep going like, uh-oh, no, inflation, no, then we go back. So like an expansion on your business cycle is an increase in GDP, a contraction is a decrease in GDP, stuff like that. Not a graph you ever have to worry about from drawing it. A graph you should be able to visualize as like the general life cycle of an economy. You only move left to right, not right to left. Time is your x-axis. That's why you can't travel backwards in time. That kind of thing. Okay, that's the business cycle. That's literally it for the business cycle. The circular flow model, everyone's favorite model from Unit 1 that they all suck at, which I never understand. I don't get why you guys are bad at this. Either I'm terrible at explaining it, or you guys' brains don't work for the first 2 weeks of the class. I couldn't tell you. The circular flow model is the flow of money in your economy. It just tells you that income equals spending. That all the money you earn was someone else's spending, that they had to earn. That was somebody else's spending, that they had to earn. That someone else's spending, that they had to earn. The visuals that you're seeing that might throw you off is that households buy products from businesses. That isn't crazy. That's very easy to get. You buy stuff from businesses. You understand that. Businesses sell things in the product market. You buy things in the product market. There isn't actually a physical product market, but like anytime you buy a good, you are engaging in the product market. You bought it from a business. Good job. So we give them money, they give us stuff. Not hard. Top half, people do mess it up, do get tricked, do get confused. The factor market is the market for resources, your factors of production. Land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. The majority of those that businesses buy, including ones that they guarantee need, they buy from us. You get paid for your labor by a business. That is you selling your labor. A business is purchasing it off of you. You're selling yourself to a business when you are taking a job. They are paying you a wage. They're giving you money for a thing. Same idea. So in the factor market, you as the household are the seller. Businesses are the buyer. Because you get paid money, which then in return you give back to the business for stuff. They give you money for your labor. They then earn that money back through your spending. I will never understand how this is so hard for people to get. Okay. Leakages, which is a weird thing. They don't always talk about it, but I'll leave it here. A leakage is a thing that makes money leave the model. Like, this is the model of your economy. It's meant to be kind of insular. That I give business money, they give me thing. They use that money to pay their worker get money to go buy more thing. Like, that's the kind of gist of it. There are a couple of things that limit that. The ones that AP exams have asked about before are things like imports and savings. Because if you import goods from another country, where does the money go? Buy a good from another country, the money goes out. It does not go back into your economy guaranteed. It goes to that economy. So importing goods is a leakage from the circular flow model because it's the flow of money in your economy. So if you're buying things from another country, money's going there, it's leaving. That's a leakage. If you are saving your money, business pay me money, I hoard it. It's no longer flowing. It's been taken out of the model. So people or businesses saving and hoarding their wealth is also a leakage of this model. It is money that is leaving it. Money is no longer flowing in the economy if you save it or holding it back. It might eventually go back in when you spend it, but whenever you start saving it, you are taking it out of the economy. Again, you won't have to draw the business cycle. You won't have to draw the circular flow model. They will ask about them, so you do need to know them. I would draw them once in your journal so you have the visual reference of it, so you know what they're talking about, but I wouldn't memorize drawing it, if that makes sense. Like, knowing this is basically the model itself. Okay, the last one, the weird one. I tie this in Unit 6 or Unit 5. The aggregate production function. This curve. Capital stock is the X, output is the Y. This is just an example of it shifting. This is not like you don't draw both lines. It's just one line. The trend line is just there to show you that it moved up. But this curve is like the actual graph itself. This like initial curve. The idea is the more capital stock you've got, the more you can produce, but there is a diminishing return. Like, it doesn't go up forever. It flattens out. Because, like, capital stock's all the tools, tech, and machinery I have. I could have 80 billion computers. I kind of need people to operate them, though. So, like, I don't need 80 billion. I only need however many I need for my people. If I keep adding more and more on top of it, it gets kind of useless. So for the, like, why does it taper off? It's because there is diminishing returns, because capital stock doesn't compound infinitely. It compounds based on how many people can actually be using it. But better tech or resources will shift the entire function up, because now you're getting way more output for what is effectively the same total amount of capital stock. It's just higher quality capital stock. Does that make sense? This was only added to the AP exam's list of things for us to cover 2 years ago, so it's one of the newest things they've added. Because of last year's test not having a multiple choice portion, we have yet to see a question over it. So I don't know how they'll ask about it. If they did, it would be just one question, and that one question would be probably either about how capital stock helps you produce more in the short and long term, or that capital stock does not compound infinitely because you need people to actually operate a lot of the capital stock. Machinery, factories, all those kinds of things, all that physical capital needs operation. Until we go to full cyborg people and everything like that. Okay, the last thing. Promise you don't get freaked out. Promise me you don't get freaked out. I never showed you this because they've never asked about it. They've never mentioned it. They've never even mentioned that they were going to ask about it on the macro exam. They've asked about it on micro. They haven't asked about it on macro. It's some teachers list it as a thing they cover. I don't see it anywhere on the CED for AP Macro. I'm just going to mention it to you here just in case they ask literally one question over it. They will not have you draw it. It is not a draw graph. It is maybe a no graph, but they never asked about it either. It's called the Laffer curve. It looks weird. It looks kind of confusing. Tax revenue goes up as tax rate goes up, but then eventually goes back down as tax rate goes up. That's weird. This diagram is not to scale. It's not always at like 50% that it's the turning point. It's just an example. Here's the idea. The idea is more important than the visual. Because this idea is the basis for like US economic policy in the 1980s and is still kind of one of the bases of the economic policy for the Republican Party in the United States, as well as a lot of conservative parties globally. The idea is increasing taxes past a certain threshold is counterproductive. And not just counterproductive in that like people will not spend as much, but like the government will not earn as much in tax revenue if they tax past a certain level. Like say that level is 50%, which is what the visual of this graph is. That like as I go up to 50%, I'm getting, at some point it's petering out, it's tapering off. Why? Why does it start to go back down? Because the more and more and more you tax people as a percentage, the less likely they are to work. If I were to tax you for 90% of your income, there's a decent chance you wouldn't even want to have a job at that point. So then you wouldn't be generating any tax revenue if that person doesn't have a job. Now, this is purely theoretical. purely theoretical, but it is a useful theory to be aware of because it is one, the basis of an entire half of our country's like economic policy is that taxes going up past a certain level isn't even going to make your government money, which is important for like balance of trade and doing a budget deficit and stuff like that. Like the idea is like, okay, well, we just got to tax people more and then we can get more tax revenue and the government can pay for more stuff. It's like, yeah, but at some point taxing people too much becomes prohibitive, not just from their spending, but like if you tax them too much, they might not even want to work because they won't be even making enough money off of their income because of how much they're being taxed. Again, purely theoretical. Again, it's not at 50% guarantee. It is just an example. But the logic is taxes going up might not help you as much as you would like because people are less likely to work the more you tax. I have not seen a question about it. I've just seen enough AP Econ teachers I look at on Facebook mention it that I'm like, let's just show it to you and explain it in case. The theory is always good to know for the real world of like, oh, that's actually kind of a good thing. That's a good like argument to be aware of like, oh, maybe raising taxes too high actually doesn't make you money as a government. Maybe. But if the government is providing a lot of services with that money, they might still, work and earn taxes. And if you're making a high enough amount of money, that the tax percentage won't matter. Also kind of helps explain why taxing rich people a bunch isn't that helpful, but that argument doesn't work as best. That should be it, right? Yeah, it is. Oh my god. Okay. Whew. All right. That is everything in the PowerPoint. That is every graph, model, FRQ style topic I have ever seen and would ever project to be an FRQ. They've done weird random things before. You guys saw the one where it was like, is this in GDP or not as an FRQ? They do weird stuff, but things that have been repeated, patterns, stuff that is frequently asked. You have seen all of them. You have seen every graph. You have seen every math thing in some capacity, at least from a template standpoint. You might have to review other formulas, but that's how the math problems kind of work. That is everything I can do from a Super Saturday standpoint to hard prep you for the FRQ. I can throw more stuff, I can pull up more FRQs, I can do more, but from a foundation level of knowledge, that is it. Is there anything any of you want me to hit, go over, explain in more detail? I still got 20 more minutes of time that I can spend, but in terms of things that I had planned to cover, I have covered everything I planned to cover. 3 hours, 36 minutes in. Did it. God, I'm incredible. Okay, so anything else you guys want me to hit? I know the laughter curve is a weird thing to throw in at the end. It's just in case they do it. I don't think they will, but just making sure. Cover my bases. Reminder that on Monday morning, I will be doing a cram session in the morning. So if you're reviewing things this weekend and you're like, he didn't really explain this recessionary gap with multiplier stuff, I'm going to ask him about that on Monday. Good. Write it down. Get ready to ask me about it in the cram session on Monday, because that Monday cram session is not like this. It is not structured. It is user feedback. It is what do you want me to review. I'm doing all that stuff on Monday's live stream. Arhan, thank you. Will, thank you guys. Appreciate y'all for tuning in live. Dan, thank you. You stuck through for pretty much the entire thing, Dan. Much appreciated. Spread the word to your friends who haven't watched this video yet. I know we didn't have that many people watching live. That's fine. I know today's prom for you guys. So feel free to encourage your friends to watch this thing tomorrow before the AP exam. This will help them a bunch, I know, on the FRQ section, all that stuff. Thank you all a bunch for watching. Thanks for the questions in the chat, by the way, guys. Those were all very helpful and good. Those are always great things to ask. If you end up having questions in the comments, leave them below. I know some of you guys were leaving questions in some of my videos earlier the last couple of days because some of you guys have been watching them the past few days to cram. Keep asking those questions in the chat of those videos. I'm checking them all day today and tomorrow and Monday morning, and I'm answering all of them I can to get you guys ready for the exam. I want to do everything I can to make sure you guys can pass this thing, because a lot of you guys put in, frankly, a hell of a lot of work to this class last semester or this semester, and you deserve a college credit for it. And I'll make sure that you get it. So I'm not worried about spending too much time on y'all. Krishnov, thank you for watching. Sarah, thank you for watching. All of you guys, much appreciated. If you got anything else for me, feel free to leave it in the chat. I'll stay AFK in this video for a few more minutes, but if I don't get anything else in the next few minutes, I will sign out here in a little bit. Archer, say goodbye to everybody. Let's do this. Come here, Bubba. Come here. Oh my god, he hates getting picked up so much.
Hey, Chihuahua boy.
Oh, don't lick my mouth. Please don't do that. Look at him. Oh, no, God, don't. Please don't lick me in the face. Please stop. Yes, what is it? Well, no, it's not comfortable. Okay. Don't jump. Okay, cool. I was scared because I'm wearing shorts and you could scratch my legs up really bad there. Text message. Oh, it's windy right now. I know there's a wind advisory today, so be careful on your way out. If you're going to prom, people's hair's gonna get messed up like crazy because of the wind today. It's not raining, but it's windy. Yeah, if you have any more questions for me, feel free to leave them. I'll be signing off here in about a minute or two because I have completed the video. Unless you have a question, I can still answer. But that should be it. This video will save on this channel, so you'll be able to access the earlier parts of it if you weren't able to watch it live, or if you tuned in a bit late. You'll be able to see the earlier parts of this video whenever you go back into it, but it'll save on my YouTube, and I'll make sure to link the PowerPoint I used both in the description of this video as well as on my Moodle under AP Exam Review. There's like AP Super Saturday stuff as a folder there. You can pull this PowerPoint up on that. So if you want to go back through like all the text that's on here, all like little hints and tricks and stuff, feel free to. There's also like a little cheat sheet on there of like graph review that I put on there as well, with like little like small boxes of like what the graphs are and stuff like that. My allergies are much better today, which is very nice. Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to log off here. Thank you all for watching. Appreciate it. Again, on Monday morning from about 8 a.m. until 11:30, like right up until you guys will be going down to wherever you're testing, I'll be doing a live stream cram session, which is just throw questions at me. I'll go over whatever. I have the full database of FRQs ready to go. I'll have a full whiteboard because I'll be in the school for it. I'll bring my camera and my mic so the quality is still pretty good. Can't guarantee the stream output quality will be great because it's on the school's Wi-Fi and not mine, and mine is fiber optics. So I can't guarantee it'll be as good of an audio quality stream, but or at least good as quality as like live, but it will still function and be useful. So if you've got questions or you review stuff over the weekend and you see things that you need explained or things you want me just to like go through a problem or two over, mark them down. You're not inconveniencing me. My job is to help you pass the AP exam. I'm going to help you pass the AP exam. My job's to teach you, but like for Monday, it's to pass the AP exam. That's what my job is. Cool. Thank you all very much for watching. I greatly appreciate the feedback and the support and everything. I wish you all the absolute best of luck on your AP exam this year. And thank you guys. Really appreciate it.